Stop for just 1 second. Don't fix anything, don't sit up straighter, don't do a single thing on purpose. I only want you to notice one small, quiet fact about yourself that you have almost certainly never noticed before. Where is your tongue right now? This very instant, is it lying flat and slack along the floor of your mouth, down near the bottom teeth, just resting there like a cat asleep on a warm floor? Or is it lifted, pressed up softly against the roof of your mouth, the broad middle of it suctioned against that dome overhead, the tip of it tucked up behind your top front teeth on that little ridge? You don't have to move it. Just find it. Just locate the thing. Now take one ordinary breath. Nothing special. Don't make it big. Don't make it slow. Don't perform it. And while you do, notice which road the air takes. Does it come in through your nose, cool and quiet, sliding up behind your face? Or does it come in over your tongue and past your lips, through the open door of your mouth? Just notice. That's all. One breath, one small observation. Here is the innocent little question I want to hang on that. It's the kind of question a child asks, the kind that sounds too simple to bother with. What actually changes if that tongue just drops? Suppose it's up right now, sealed against the roof of your mouth, and suppose it lets go and slumps down to the floor. How much has really happened? A few millimeters of soft muscle has moved from up here to down there. That's the whole event. A little wet muscle, weighing about as much as a plum, sliding a short distance downward. You'd think the answer is nothing. You'd think the answer is that almost nothing at all has changed, because almost nothing has moved, and the amount of matter involved is tiny. And you would be wrong, not a little wrong, spectacularly, wonderfully wrong. Because there is a law of physics, a real one, an old one, worked out with pipes and fluids long before anybody was thinking about tongues, that says something almost outrageous about narrow passages. It says that when you make a channel that carries a flowing fluid just slightly narrower, the effort it takes to push that fluid through does not creep up politely in proportion. It does not go up a little when you squeeze the passage a little. It explodes. Squeeze the passage down to half its width, and the resistance to flow, the sheer work required to move the same air, doesn't double. It goes up by a factor of 16. 16. From one soft muscle losing its posture and letting a passage sag. That's the kind of thing I love, because it offends common sense. And whenever nature offends common sense, that's exactly where the interesting business is hiding. And I'll tell you now, quietly, so you don't get too excited before we've earned it, that the 16 is not even the strangest part. It's not close to the strangest part. Because if you keep that tongue up, or if you let it stay down, not for one breath, but for years, for a whole childhood, the position of that little muscle starts to do something that sounds frankly like magic. It starts to reshape the actual bones of your face, the length of your upper jaw, the angle of your lower jaw, the width of the breathing tube at the back of your throat. Slowly, silently, over years, the tongue acts like a sculptor's thumb pressing on wet clay, and the skull obliges. We will get all the way to that. I promise you, we will stand over the X-ray trays together and look at it. But not yet. That's a shape on the far horizon. For now, let's walk toward it one honest step at a time, and let's start with the simplest thing of all. Let's start with the seal. Think about what your tongue is actually doing when it's up, when the broad body of it is pressed against the roof of your mouth, against that hard dome the anatomists call the hard palate, and the tip of it is resting up on that little bump behind your top front teeth. It is doing something a plumber would recognize instantly. It is making a seal. It is closing a door. When the tongue is up like that, the whole floor of the nose, the whole back cavity is open and clear, but the mouth, the oral cavity underneath, is shut off. The tongue lies against the roof like a lid pressed onto a jar. And when the lid is on, the air has nowhere to go but the one road left open. It has to go through the nose. It has no choice. You have, without thinking about it, without deciding anything, closed one of the two doors into your lungs and left only the other one open. That is the resting posture of a person whose body has quietly settled on breathing through the nose as its default. The tongue up, filling the roof of the mouth, sealing it, the lips lightly together, the jaw held gently closed by the tongue's own gentle upward suction. In that arrangement, every breath is routed automatically through the nose. You are not deciding to breathe through your nose. Your tongue is deciding it for you, by geometry, by simply being where it is and closing the door that isn't being used. Now let the tongue drop. Let it fall to the floor of the mouth, down among the lower teeth, slack and low. Watch what unravels, because it's a lovely little cascade and every piece of it follows from the piece before. First, the seal is gone. The lid is off the jar. The mouth cavity is now open air, connected straight back to the throat. Second, without the tongue pressing gently up and holding things together, the jaw tends to sag open a little. There's nothing holding it shut anymore from the inside. And third, and this is the part that will matter enormously when we get to the physics, when the tongue slumps low and the jaw drops back, the soft tissues at the back of the throat crowd inward, and the breathing passage back there gets narrower. So now you have two roads open instead of one, and the easy one, the wide one, the one the air will naturally prefer, is the mouth. And the mouth has just quietly become the default. Not by any decision, just by a muscle giving up its post. So already, before we've done any real physics at all, you can feel the shape of the thing. A tongue up is a nose breather. A tongue down is a mouth breather. One small muscle in one of two positions, silently choosing which of two doors your air comes through, thousands upon thousands of times a day, while you think about entirely other things. You breathe something like 20,000 times a day, and you decide almost none of them. The tongue decides, or rather, wherever the tongue happens to rest decides, and the tongue rests wherever a lifetime of habit has parked it. Now I've been a little quick just there, and I want to be honest with you, because being honest about how sure we are is the whole game in this business. The claim that tongue posture is what drives the choice between nose and mouth, that the tongue sealing the palate is the cause and the nasal breathing is the effect, that particular claim rests on the work of the people who study the muscles of the mouth and face, and it's sensible and it fits everything else, but it is not nailed down with the same iron certainty as, say, the law about the narrow pipe. So let's hold it a little loosely. Let's say the tongue up and the mouth sealed and the air going through the nose all travel together, they come as a package, and there are good mechanical reasons to think the tongue's position is doing a lot of the driving. Good enough to build on. Not so good that I'd swear to the exact chain of cause in every last person. Keep that little grain of caution in your pocket. We'll be adding more certain things on top of it as we go, and the certain things will hold the whole structure up. Because here's where we're headed, and I want you to feel the ground we're going to cover, gently, like reading the first page of a long book you already know you're going to enjoy. We started with a muscle. Next, we're going to look hard at that exploding 16 at the law of the narrow pipe and really understand why nature punishes small squeezes so brutally. Then we're going to creep into a sleep laboratory and look at 12 people wired to instruments through the night and see the difference between the two doors measured in cold numbers. Then, and this is one of my favorite turns in the whole story, we're going to discover that the nose is secretly a little chemical factory, quietly manufacturing a gas, a real gas, with every breath you pull through it, a gas the mouth root skips entirely. We'll follow that gas. We'll watch what humming does to it. We'll find out why breathing that feels slightly harder can actually deliver more oxygen to a working muscle, not less, which sounds backward and isn't. And at the very end, we'll stand over those X-ray trays and watch the bones themselves keep the score. But all of that, every last bit of it, hangs off the little observation you made 30 seconds ago when you found your own tongue and noticed where it was sitting. So keep noticing it. Don't move it on purpose. Just let it stay wherever it's settled, and let's go find out why it matters so much more than a plum-sized muscle has any right to. Let me start where any honest investigation ought to start, which is with the plain shape of the thing. Put your attention back inside your own mouth for a moment. There is a ceiling in there. Run the tip of your tongue forward along it, just behind your upper front teeth, and you'll find a little firm ridge, a small bump of tissue. Anatomists have a name for it, the incisive papilla, but the name doesn't matter. What matters is that this ridge is a landmark. It's the spot where, in a person who breathes quietly through the nose all day without ever thinking about it, the tip of the tongue likes to rest. Not pressing hard, not straining, just settling there the way a cat settles into the one warm patch of sun on the floor. And here's the part that most people have never once considered. It isn't only the tip that's up there. In the easy, natural resting posture, the whole broad body of the tongue is drawn up against the roof of the mouth, gently suctioned to it, like a wet leaf stuck flat against a window pane. The tongue is not lying in a heap on the floor of the mouth. It's up, spread against the palate, sealing the whole oral chamber shut from the inside. Think about what that does. If the roof of your mouth is a dome, and the tongue is pressed up into that dome all along its length, then there is simply no open room left in there. The mouth, as a passage for air, is closed. Not closed with the lips, mind you. Closed from within, by the muscle itself. And when that upper door is sealed, the air you breathe has exactly one road left to travel. Up through the nose. Every time, without you deciding anything. That's the whole trick in a sense, and we've barely begun. But sit with how quiet it is. There's no valve you can feel clicking. There's no effort you'd ever notice. A person can go their entire life in this posture and never know they're doing anything at all. The way you don't notice that you're holding your head up until somebody points it out and suddenly your neck feels like it's been working all along. The tongue-to-palate seal is like that. It is doing a real job, a mechanical job, holding a door shut, and it asks for so little in return that it hides in plain sight. Now let me tip the whole picture over, because the interesting question is never what happens when a thing works. It's what happens when it stops. Suppose the tongue doesn't rest up in the dome. Suppose instead it lies down low, slumped on the floor of the mouth, the way a tired dog flops down flat in the shade. What changes? Well, first, the seal is gone. The roof of the mouth is now an open, empty room again, and air can pour through it freely. But something else happens too, something a little sneakier, and this is where the plumbing starts to get its hooks into the biology. When the tongue lies low and forward, it stops holding the whole structure up from the inside. It's a bit like taking the center pole out of a tent. The tongue up in the palate is quietly bracing things. Drop it, and the lower jaw tends to sag open, the mouth falls slightly ajar, and the soft tissues at the back of the throat lose a little of the support they'd been leaning on without knowing it. So now you have a mouth that's open, a jaw that's dropped, and a throat that's a touch more crowded than it was a moment ago. And the body, being sensible, does the obvious thing. It starts breathing through the open door. Through the mouth. You might say, so what? A door's a door. Air is air. If I can get the same lungful of air through my mouth as through my nose, who cares which hallway it walked down to get there? And that is a completely fair objection. It's exactly the objection a smart person ought to raise. And I want to honor it, because for a long stretch it even sounds right. The air does end up in the same lungs. The oxygen is the same oxygen. If breathing were nothing but moving a certain volume of gas from outside to inside, then the road wouldn't matter one bit and we could all go home. But breathing is not just moving gas, and the first crack in the a door's a door idea comes not from biology at all. It comes from the physics of what it costs to push a fluid through a narrow pipe. Because those two doors, the nose road and the mouth road, are not the same width, and they don't stay the same width, and, as we're about to see, width is not a gentle little dial where a small change makes a small difference. Width, in a pipe, is a cruel and lopsided master. A tiny change in how wide the passage is produces an enormous change in how hard you have to work to move air through it. And once you understand that one fact, really understand it in your bones, an awful lot of confusing things about breathing suddenly click into place. So let me build up that fact carefully, because it's worth every second. Picture a garden hose, water's running through it, nice and steady. Now in your mind, squeeze the hose so its inside is half as wide as it was. How much harder is it now to push the same amount of water through per second? Most people, if you ask them cold, guess something reasonable and modest. Twice as hard maybe. 4 times if they're feeling bold. It seems like it should scale in some fair proportional way. You made the pipe half as wide, so surely the penalty is something like double or quadruple. The truth is not double. The truth is not quadruple. When you smoothly halve the width of the pipe, the resistance to flow goes up by a factor of 16. 16. You made the passage half as wide, and moving the same air now costs you 16 times the effort. And if you go the other way, if you could somehow make the passage twice as wide, the resistance would drop to 1/16 of what it was. The effort nearly vanishes. Where on earth does 16 come from? It comes from a rule worked out by a French physician a long time ago, a man who was fascinated by how blood moves through the fine vessels of the body. He was studying flow through narrow tubes, and he found something that has the flavor of a magic trick, but is really just geometry being honest. The resistance a smooth, steady flow meets in a tube depends on the radius of that tube raised to the fourth power. The fourth power, not the radius itself, not the radius squared. The radius multiplied by itself 4 times over. So when you double the radius, you don't get twice the ease. You get 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 16. And when you halve it, you pay 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 in the other direction, which is that same 16, now sitting on your chest as extra work. Let that number really land, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. Nature has arranged breathing so that the width of your air passages matters far, far more than your intuition will ever let you believe. Not a little more, wildly more. A change in width you couldn't even see with your naked eye, a slackening here, a slight narrowing there, a jaw that's dropped a couple of millimeters and let the back of the throat crowd in, none of it looking like much at all, can turn into a difference in breathing effort that is not subtle in the slightest. The passage narrows by a hair, and the fourth power takes that hair and multiplies it into something your whole body has to answer for. And now you can start to feel why the tongue, that unassuming plum-sized muscle, gets to be such an outsized character in this drama. It isn't moving much. When it lifts to the palate or slumps to the floor, when it braces the jaw or lets it sag, it is only nudging the geometry of these passages by small amounts. Small amounts. But we've just learned that in the world of pipes and flow, there are no small amounts. The fourth power doesn't do small. It takes the tongue's little architectural adjustments, the sealing of one door, the slight crowding or clearing of another, and it amplifies them into real, measurable day and night differences in how much work it takes just to keep breathing. So the tongue isn't strong. It doesn't need to be. It sits at exactly the place in the system where a gentle push gets multiplied into a shove. It is a small hand resting on a very long lever. Keep that lever in mind, because I've been talking about pipes and hoses as if breathing were a calm, steady, well-behaved flow, the kind the French physician studied. And while you're awake and relaxed, sitting in a chair, that's not far off. But the real test of any breathing system doesn't come while you're sitting calmly in a chair, paying attention, able to fix any problem the moment you notice it. The real test comes at the one time of day when you surrender all of that, when you can't notice anything, when you can't adjust, can't correct, can't decide to breathe through your nose because you've decided nothing at all. The real test comes when you're asleep. And somebody, quite cleverly, figured out how to wire up a room full of sleeping people and watch, in cold numbers, exactly what those 2 doors cost them once the conscious mind had left the building. Picture the trouble they were up against before they solved it. You cannot just ask a sleeping person how they feel about their own breathing. They don't know. Nobody knows. You have been unconscious for years of your life, and you have no report to give about any of it. So the trick was to bring the sleeper into a room, lay them down, and attach little instruments that don't care whether the mind is present or absent. Instruments that simply measure. And the number they were after was a thing called airway resistance. It's the same idea I've been circling all along. How hard does the air have to push to get where it's going? How much does the passage fight the flow? A wide, calm passage has low resistance. A pinched, fussy passage has high resistance. And you can put a real number on it in funny little units, centimeters of water pressure for every liter of air that moves each second. Don't let the units trouble you. Think of it as a toll. A high number is a high toll. The air pays more to make the trip. Now here is what they did, and it is beautifully simple once you see it. They took 12 healthy adults, ordinary people, no illness, nothing wrong with them. They let them fall into sleep, and they waited for a particular steady stretch of it, the kind called stage 2, which is a good honest middle depth of sleep, not the shallow drifting at the edge and not the deepest cellar either. A dependable place to take a reading. And then they measured the toll on the air 2 ways. Once while the air went in and out through the nose, the way the tongue-sealed door arranges it, and once while the air went in and out through the mouth. Same person, same night, same sleep, just the 2 different doors. While those people were awake, by the way, the 2 doors were nearly even. That is a detail worth pausing on, because it is exactly the kind of thing that could fool you. If you tested yourself sitting in a chair, wide awake, breathing through your mouth on purpose, you might shrug and say, well, this feels fine, I don't notice any great struggle, what is all the fuss? And you would be honestly reporting what you felt. Awake, with all your muscles quietly on duty, holding everything in its proper place, the mouth root and the nose root cost you about the same. The waking body is a diligent caretaker. It props the airway open with 100 little tensions you never think about. So the waking test tells you almost nothing. The doors look the same from the outside when the caretaker is on shift, but sleep sends the caretaker home. And when they measured the sleeping toll, the 2 numbers came apart, and they came apart hard. Breathing through the nose during that steady stage 2 sleep, the resistance was about 5, a bit over 5 in those little water pressure units, a modest toll. The air went about its business. Breathing through the mouth in the very same sleeping people, the resistance was more than 12. 12 and a bit, so more than double, nearly 2.5 times the toll, just for changing which door the air used at the one time of day when nobody is minding the door. Sit with that for a moment, because I have spent a good while telling you that in a pipe, penalties multiply. A little narrowing becomes a big resistance because of that fierce 4th power law, that unforgiving business where shrinking the radius by a hair costs you enormously in flow. So when I tell you the sleeping mouth breather pays more than twice the toll, you should already be nodding, because you know where that extra cost is hiding. When the mouth falls open in sleep, the jaw drops, and when the jaw drops, the tongue, which is no longer suctioned up where it belongs, slides back and down toward the throat. It crowds the very passage the air is trying to use. The radius shrinks, and the 4th power law does what it always does. It takes that small backward slump of a soft, heavy muscle and turns it into a wall the air has to shove past on every single breath all night long. And still, resistance is only a toll. A toll is an annoyance. You might think, so what? The air works a little harder, the sleeper doesn't even know. But the same study measured something else. Something that turns the annoyance into a genuine drama, and this is the number I want you to carry with you into whatever dream is waiting. They counted the breathing failures, the moments in the night when the airway didn't merely resist the air, but actually collapsed or clamped down enough that breathing stumbled, faltered, briefly stopped. The events where the sleeper, without ever waking, without ever knowing, was for a few seconds not really breathing at all, and they counted these per hour. Breathing through the nose, that steady sealed way, the count was about 1.5 of these events in an hour. 1.5, which is to say, almost none. A stumble here, a stumble there, across a whole hour of sleeping. The system, left to route air through the nose, held itself open and quiet and reliable hour after hour, with the conscious mind completely absent. Nobody steering, and still the ship sails straight. Now switch the door. Breathe through the mouth, same sleeping people, same instruments, same night. The count of those breathing failures went to 43 in an hour. 43, from 1.5 to 43. That is not a little worse. That is a different night entirely. That is a sleeper whose airway is faltering, on average, closer to once a minute than once an hour, for hour after hour, with no memory of any of it in the morning. Just a vague tiredness, perhaps. A sense of not being quite rested for reasons they could never name, because the reasons all happened in a room the conscious mind had already left. I find this one of the most quietly startling numbers in the whole business, and I want to tell you exactly why it startles me. It is not the size of it alone, though the size is dramatic enough. It is what the size reveals about how delicately balanced the whole arrangement is. Here is a system, your upper airway, that is perfectly capable of behaving itself all night, nearly flawlessly, a stumble or two an hour and no more. That same system changed by one thing, one single thing. The position of a door and the muscle that guards it tips over into faltering dozens of times an hour. The hardware didn't change. The person didn't change. Their health, their lungs, their heart, all the same. The only thing that changed was the path the air was invited to take and whether the tongue was up doing its quiet work or slumped back getting in the way. One variable, a 30-fold change in how often the breath failed. That is the fingerprint of a system sitting right on the edge of a cliff. And that fourth power law is the cliff. Remember, a wide passage forgives you. You can narrow a wide passage a good deal before the resistance climbs enough to matter, because you are up in the flat, gentle part of the curve where small changes stay small. But a passage that is already snug, already near its limit, sits on the steep part, where the smallest further narrowing sends the resistance shooting upward. The sleeping throat, with the caretaker off duty and the muscles gone slack, is already a snugger passage than the waking one. So it is sitting closer to the steep part, and then you drop the jaw and let the tongue slide back, and you shove it right off the edge. The nose root, by holding the mouth sealed and keeping the tongue up and forward, is the thing that was keeping the passage wide enough to stay in the forgiving zone in the first place. So you begin to see that the tongue against the roof of the mouth is not some small hygienic nicety like sitting up straight or chewing your food well. It is, quietly, one of the things standing between a sleeper and a night of 43 little suffocations an hour. And it is doing this without instruction, without effort, without anyone's awareness, purely by resting where evolution meant it to rest. A muscle holding a door shut so the air is forced to take the good road, the road that stays open even when nobody is watching it. But I have been telling you only about the plumbing so far. Only about resistance and passages and the geometry of a slumping muscle. And if plumbing were the whole story, then the moral would simply be, keep the pipe wide, and any wide pipe would do, and the nose would just be a convenient way to keep the pipe wide. That is not the whole story. Not even close. Because there is something the nose is doing that has nothing to do with keeping a passage open. Something chemical, something almost secret, that the mouth cannot do no matter how wide you hold it. There is a gas being manufactured up inside the bones of your face, quietly on every breath, and it is a gas that changes what happens deep in your lungs, in the tiny sacs where the air finally meets the blood. Nobody feels it being made. Nobody was ever taught it in school. And when you breathe through your mouth, you skip it entirely. So let me take you up into the caverns behind your cheekbones and show you the little factory that the mouth root never visits. Come with me then into the hollows of the skull. Around your nose, buried in the bone, there are chambers. Air-filled rooms, tucked behind the cheeks, above the teeth, between the eyes, and back behind the bridge of the nose. We call them the sinuses, and most people only ever think about them when they get stuffed up and achy in the winter. But they are not just empty spaces waiting to cause you trouble. The lining of those little rooms is doing chemistry. Real, patient, around-the-clock chemistry. The cells there carry a piece of machinery, an enzyme, and that enzyme takes ordinary ingredients your body always has lying around, and it makes a gas. A simple gas. One atom of nitrogen, one atom of oxygen, stuck together. Nitric oxide, we call it. And it just keeps making it. Not in a burst, not when you sneeze, but steadily, like a candle that never quite goes out. Now here is the thing I want you to sit with, because it is genuinely strange. This gas is being made up in the bone, in those side rooms off the main hallway of the nose. And every time you draw a breath in through your nostrils, the air comes sweeping down that hallway, and it picks up a little of the gas on the way past, the way a river picks up the smell of the reeds on the bank, and it carries it down the throat, down the windpipe, into the lungs. So the air that arrives in your lungs through the nose is not the same air that sat in the room. It has been seasoned. It has a whisper of this gas mixed into it that it did not have before it entered you. And what does the gas do when it gets down there? This is the lovely part. Deep in the lungs you have those tiny sacs, millions of them, Little wet bubbles of tissue where the air finally comes close enough to the blood to hand over its oxygen. Around each of those sacs runs a fine mesh of blood vessels, so fine you could not see one without a microscope. And this gas, the nitric oxide riding in on your breath, it touches the walls of those little vessels and it tells them to relax, to open up, to widen. The muscle in the vessel wall goes soft and the vessel loosens and more blood can flow through. So the gas is a signal. It is a message written in chemistry that says, open the gates here, let the blood come, there is air waiting. Think about how clever that is, and how quiet. The oxygen and the blood have to meet in the same place at the same time, or the whole trade falls apart. It is no good pouring air into a part of the lung where no blood is flowing, and it is no good pumping blood past a part of the lung where no air has reached. You need them matched up, air here, blood here, right next to each other. And this little gas helps do the matching. It rides in on the air, and wherever the air goes, it opens the blood vessels to come and meet it. The air itself carries the instructions for its own reception. I find that almost too neat to believe, and yet there it is, happening in you a dozen times a minute while you lie here doing nothing at all. There is a fine word for a gas like this, a word some of the scientists who studied it like to use. They called it an aerocrine signal. Do not let the word frighten you. You already know the pieces of it hiding in other words. Aero, that is air, like an airplane, a thing of the air. And crine, that is the same crine you find in the glands of the body that release things, the way your mouth waters or your skin sweats. So an aerocrine signal is simply a message the body releases into the air itself and then breathes back in, to act somewhere far away from where it was made in the bones of the face, delivered to the depths of the lungs, carried the whole way by nothing but your own inhaling. It is a kind of internal mail surface that runs on breath. And now you see the trouble with the mouth. When you breathe in through your open mouth, the air does not go past those side rooms in the bone. It does not sweep down the nasal hallway. It comes straight in over the tongue, down the throat, and into the windpipe, and it never picks up the gas at all. The little factory is still running. The candle is still lit. But you have walked in through the back door and missed the whole shop. The gas is being made and you are simply not collecting it. So the mouth breather sends air to the lungs that has not been seasoned, air that carries no message to open the vessels, and the fine matching of air to blood is left to fend for itself. It still works. Your body is forgiving. But it works with a little less help than it was designed to have. You are leaving something on the table, breath after breath, and you never knew the table was set. Let me put a number on how alive this little factory is, because I do not want you to picture some feeble trickle you could ignore. Some clever people wanted to know just how much this gas production depends on the air moving past those rooms, on the stirring of the air. Because if the gas just leaks out at a steady rate no matter what, that is one story. But if you could stir the air and coax more of it out, that is a much more interesting story. And to test it, they hit upon a trick so simple it makes you laugh. They had people hum. Yes, humming. That thing you do without thinking when a tune is stuck in you, or when you are pleased and half asleep. This was at a research institute in Sweden, the Karolinska, in the year 2002. 10 healthy people. And what they did was measure the amount of nitric oxide coming out of the nose. First, while the person breathed out through the nose quietly, gently, no sound. And then while the person hummed that same breath out, that buzzing drone in the nose that you can feel tickle the inside of your face. And they had a sensitive instrument catching the gas and counting it. A machine that sees the gas by the faint light a certain reaction gives off. Now what would you guess? If you hum instead of breathing out quietly, how much more of the gas comes out? A little more? A quarter more? Maybe, if you are feeling generous, twice as much? The answer they found was 15 times as much. 15 times. Not 15%. 15-fold. The humming breath carried out 15 times the nitric oxide of the silent breath. I want you to really feel how enormous that is. You change nothing about the person, Nothing about the ingredients, nothing about the enzyme in the walls. You only make the air buzz. And the little factory pours out its product 15 times faster. Why on earth would buzzing do that? Picture those side rooms again, the sinuses, tucked off the main hallway. In quiet breathing, the air in the hallway and the air in the side rooms barely mingle. There is a little doorway connecting each room to the hallway, a narrow opening, and through that narrow opening the gas has to seep out slowly, on its own time, by ordinary drifting. The room is like a quiet pantry off a busy kitchen. Not much passes through the doorway unless something stirs it. But when you hum, you set the air trembling. The sound is nothing but the air shaking back and forth very fast, and that shaking reaches into the little rooms and sloshes their air in and out through the narrow doorways. Back and forth, hundreds of times a second. And every slosh brings fresh gas out of the room and into the hallway where your breath can grab it. The humming is a pump made of sound. It works the doorway between the pantry and the kitchen so hard that 15 times as much comes spilling through. You were, without ever knowing it, ventilating the caverns of your own face with a song. I love this result for a reason beyond the number. It tells you the gas has been sitting there, ready, in reserve, in those rooms, all along. It is not that humming makes more gas quickly. It is that humming lets out the gas that was already waiting behind the narrow door. Which means those little rooms are a storehouse, quietly filling, and the ordinary quiet breath only ever draws down a fraction of what is kept there. Hum, and you open the storehouse. And the storehouse is one more thing, one more good thing, that lives entirely on the nasal road. Close your mouth, breathe through your nose, and the whole apparatus is yours. Open your mouth, and the pantry, the candle, the little factory, the storehouse, the buzzing pump, all of it goes on running behind a door you have simply stopped walking through. So we have found something the plumbing never told us. 2 roads into the lung look, from the outside, like they should do the same job, just move air. And one of them turns out to be lined with chemistry the other one lacks completely. But I have been talking as though more gas, more opening, more air is always simply better. More. And nature is almost never that simple. There is a trade hiding underneath all of this, a bargain your body strikes with every breath, and it runs exactly opposite to what your common sense would tell you. It has to do with a gas you have been taught your whole life to think of as waste, as garbage, as the stuff you are trying to get rid of. And I am going to try to convince you that getting rid of too much of it is one of the quiet ways the mouth breather shortchanges himself. So let us leave the little factory humming behind us and go look at the gas everyone throws away. Think about carbon dioxide for a moment. You breathe it out. You have always breathed it out. Somewhere along the way, you got the idea that it is simply exhaust, the smoke from the engine, the thing your body is desperate to be free of. And there is a grain of truth in that. Carbon dioxide is a product of burning fuel inside your cells, and if it piled up without limit, it would poison you. So the picture in your head is a chimney. Fuel goes in, smoke comes out, and the more smoke you can clear, the cleaner the fire burns. It is a tidy picture. It is also, when it comes to your breathing, quietly and importantly wrong. Let me show you where it goes wrong, and I want to do it slowly, because this is the part where common sense fights you the hardest. Your blood carries oxygen, but oxygen does not just dissolve in the blood like sugar in tea. If it did, you would need gallons and gallons of blood to keep a person alive. Instead, the oxygen is carried by a marvelous little molecule called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the porter of the body. It is a molecule whose whole job is to grab oxygen in the lungs, hold onto it while it rides through the arteries, and then let go of it out in the tissues where the oxygen is actually needed. Grab in the lungs. Release in the muscle. Grab, ride, release. That is the entire trade. Now here is the delicate thing. A porter who grabs too tightly is no good to you. If hemoglobin held its oxygen with a perfect death grip, it would sail right through your hard-working muscle and never hand anything over. And a porter who holds too loosely is no good either, because then it drops its cargo in the wrong place, back in the arteries before it ever arrives. So the porter must be clever. It must hold tightly where oxygen is plentiful, in the lungs, and it must loosen its grip exactly where oxygen is scarce in the tissue that is starving for it. The porter must change its mind depending on where it is standing. And the question that ought to be nagging at you is, how on earth does a dumb molecule know where it is? It has no eyes. It has no map. How does it know it has arrived at the hungry muscle and it is time to let go? And the answer, the beautiful answer, is carbon dioxide. The very gas you were taught to throw away is the signal that tells the porter where it is. Out in a muscle that is working hard, that is burning fuel, carbon dioxide is being produced in floods. That carbon dioxide dissolves into the surrounding blood, and when it does, it makes the blood there a touch more acidic. Just a touch. The acidity nudges up, the pH nudges down, and hemoglobin can feel that change the way your hand can feel a room getting warmer. And when hemoglobin feels that little rise in acidity, that little breath of carbon dioxide around it, it loosens its grip and drops its oxygen right there. Exactly where the oxygen is wanted. The carbon dioxide is not exhaust in that moment. It is an address written on an envelope. It says, "Deliver here." This is a real named thing in physiology. It is called the Bohr effect, after the Danish physiologist who described it, and it is not a theory or an interpretation. It is measured chemistry. Rising carbon dioxide and the falling pH that rides along with it shift what people call the oxygen dissociation curve to the right. And shifting it to the right is just the technical way of saying the porter unloads more of its cargo into the tissue. More carbon dioxide around the muscle, more oxygen handed to the muscle. Let that settle for a second, because it runs backward to everything the chimney picture told you. The waste gas is what pries the oxygen loose and gives it to you. So now, and only now, are we ready to see the trade. Because the mouth breather and the nose breather are not just moving air through two different pipes. They are keeping two different amounts of this signaling gas in the blood, and they do not know it. When you breathe through your mouth, the door is wide, the resistance is low, and it is easy to move a great deal of air quickly. It is easy to overdo it. The wide open mouth breather tends to blow, to sigh, to overventilate without meaning to pump the bellows faster and harder than the fire actually requires. And every big fast breath out through that wide door flushes carbon dioxide out of the blood a little more aggressively. He is very good at clearing the chimney. He is so good at it that he clears out some of the very gas his hemoglobin needs in order to release oxygen properly. He purges the address off the envelope. And the strange, almost paradoxical result is that a person who is breathing big and fast and easy can end up delivering less oxygen to his tissues, not more, because he has scrubbed away the signal that unlocks the cargo. More air moved, less oxygen delivered. The bellows works harder and the fire gets less. Now bring back the nose. The nose is the narrow door. We spent a long while on why it is narrow, on that unforgiving fourth power, on how the tongue pressed to the roof of the mouth routes you through this smaller passage. And the narrow door does something the wide door cannot. It slows you down. It puts a gentle brake on every breath. You cannot flush air through your nostrils the way you can gulp it through an open mouth. The resistance itself, the very thing that made mouth breathing feel easier, means the nose breather retains a little more carbon dioxide in his blood with every cycle. Not a dangerous amount. Not enough to poison anything. Just enough to keep the signal strong, to keep the envelope addressed, so that his hemoglobin porters keep handing over their oxygen exactly where it is wanted. So the breathing that feels slightly harder delivers more, and the breathing that feels effortless delivers less. That is the trade hiding underneath all the plumbing and all the chemistry, and it is why I told you a while back that nature is almost never as simple as more, more, more. The narrow road, the resisted breath, the small tax the nose charges you on every inhale, buys you a currency you did not know you were spending. It buys you carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide, it turns out, is the key that fits the lock. I find this genuinely lovely, and I want to sit in it for a moment before we move on, because it teaches a lesson that goes far beyond breathing. The lesson is this. When you find a system that has been tuned by an enormous stretch of time and you find something in it that looks like waste, look again. Look very carefully before you decide it is garbage. Very often the thing that looks like a flaw, the thing that looks like something you would engineer away if only you were in charge, is doing a job so quiet and so clever that you never noticed it was a job at all. The carbon dioxide looked like smoke. It was a messenger. The resistance in the nose looked like a defect, an inefficiency, a narrowing you would widen if you could. It was a governor keeping the whole delicate exchange in balance. And I have to be honest with you, the way I always try to be honest about where the edges of this are. Everything I have just told you about the Bohr effect is rock solid. It is textbook chemistry, measured 1,000 times over. The part where I connect it to the nose keeping more carbon dioxide than the mouth is sound in its direction, but I do not want you to walk away thinking a single slow nose breath transforms your bloodstream. These are gentle effects, small shifts, the kind that matter because they run all day and all night, every breath for a lifetime. That is the recurring theme of this whole talk, if you have not caught it yet. Tiny things repeated without end become large things. A little resistance, a little gas, a little grip loosened at the right moment, multiplied by the 20-odd thousand breaths you will take before tomorrow night. But I have left something out, and it has been standing quietly in the corner this whole time, which is a little embarrassing since the entire lecture began with it. I have been talking about the tongue as a gate, a piece of soft machinery that seals a door and routes the traffic, as though once it presses to the roof of the mouth, its work is done and it just sits there like a sandbag holding a top down. That is not what the tongue is at all. The tongue is a muscle, a restless, powerful, endlessly busy muscle, and even when it looks perfectly still, it is doing something. Especially, it turns out, in the very moments when you would least expect it to be paying attention. There is a reflex in there, buried in the meat of the tongue, that answers a signal you cannot feel and never notice. Every time you pull a breath inward, something in your throat drops, a faint suction, a whisper of negative pressure, and the tongue feels it, and the tongue answers back. So let us go and listen for the signal the tongue is listening for, the one that arrives with every single breath, in the dark, without asking your permission. Picture the throat as a soft tube, not a rigid pipe like the plumbing under your sink, but a floppy thing, a wet cloth sleeve held open by muscles and by habit. When you breathe in, you do not push air into your lungs. That is not how it works, and it is worth pausing on, because almost everybody has it backward. You do not push, you pull. The chest widens, the diaphragm, that big sheet of muscle under your lungs, flattens downward, and the space inside your chest gets bigger. And when a sealed space gets bigger, with the same amount of stuff inside it, the pressure in there falls. It drops below the pressure of the room. And air, being an obliging crowd that always shuffles from where it is packed tight to where there is more elbow room, comes streaming in through your nose to fill the low-pressure space. That is the whole trick of a breath. You make a little emptiness inside yourself, and the sky rushes in to patch it. But here is the thing about pulling air through a soft floppy tube. The very act of pulling tugs on the walls of the tube. Suck on a paper straw, an ordinary drinking straw, and pull hard, and you will feel it pinch itself flat in the middle. The suction that draws the drink up is the same suction that wants to collapse the straw. Your throat is a far better straw than paper, but it is made of soft tissue, and it feels the same temptation. Every time you inhale, the negative pressure that pulls the air in also pulls inward on the walls of your airway. It wants just a little to close the very door it is drawing breath through. And that would be a catastrophe if nothing answered it. You would inhale, the throat would pinch shut, and you would choke on nothing at all, on empty air, on the mere effort of wanting it. So nature put a sentry on the wall, and the sentry is your tongue. Deep in the root of the tongue there is a muscle with a wonderful clumsy name, the genioglossus, and you do not have to remember that, you only have to remember what it does. It runs from the inside of your chin back into the body of the tongue, and when it fires, it pulls the tongue forward and stiffens it and braces it. Now, people took healthy volunteers, wide awake, sitting in a chair, and they put a tiny sensor on this muscle to listen to its electrical chatter, the little crackle a muscle makes when it works. And then they gave the airway a small pull, not a big one, A gentle tug of negative pressure inside the nose, somewhere between 2.5 and 7.5 centimeters of water, which is a soft, polite suction, about what you would make sipping tea without meaning to. And every time that little suck of pressure arrived, the muscle answered. Right away. No thinking, no deciding. The suction pulse came in, and the tongue muscle lit up and braced, stiffening the wall, holding the door open against the very force trying to close it. That is a reflex, in the truest sense of the word. It is a conversation the body holds with itself below the floor of your awareness. The pressure asks a question, and the muscle answers it, and the whole exchange is over in a fraction of a second. Again and again, thousands of times an hour, in the middle of the most ordinary breathing you will ever do. You are not the one keeping your airway open right now. Your tongue is doing it, quietly on its own initiative, on the strength of a signal you have never once felt. And now you can see why the resting position of this muscle matters so much more than it seems to. A tongue that already lives up against the roof of the mouth, suctioned to the palate, is a tongue that is home, positioned, forward, ready. It is a fire brigade that already sleeps at the station. When the suction of a breath arrives, the answer is a small correction from an already good posture. But a tongue that is slumped down onto the floor of the mouth, fallen back toward the throat like a drape sliding off its rod, that tongue has further to travel and more to fight, and the door it guards is already narrower before the pulling even begins. Same reflex, same muscle, same faithful sentry. But you have posted him at the wrong end of the hall. You feel this most, of course, when the sentry is off duty or nearly. In sleep, the muscle tone of the whole body drops. Everything goes slack. The genioglossus keeps working through the night, but it works with a lighter hand, drowsy, its reflex a little slower to answer the call. And this is exactly why a person can breathe perfectly well sitting up in a doctor's office, and then, hours into the dark, when the tongue relaxes and the reflex softens and the jaw has fallen open, begin to struggle. The airway that behaved all day misbehaves at night, because the guard who held it open all day has finally, understandably, begun to nod. So the tongue is no sandbag. It is an active thing, a working muscle with a reflex wired straight into the mechanics of every breath, bracing a soft tube against its own tendency to collapse. Hold that picture. We will need it later, when we look at what happens over years and not just over a single night. But now I want to leave the throat for a while and go back up to the front door, to the nose itself, because we have been treating the nose as though its only job were to be a narrow pipe that makes you work a little harder. As though it were merely the resistance in the circuit. And that is a poor and stingy way to think about it. The nose is not a pipe. The nose is a workshop. It is a small, warm, wet, marvelously outfitted little factory sitting right in the middle of your face, and it does 3 separate jobs on every lungful of air before that air is ever allowed down into the delicate country of the lungs. And the mouth, the poor bare mouth, does none of them. Think about what the air outside is actually like. Suppose it is a cold morning, the kind where your breath comes out as a little cloud. The air out there might be freezing and dry as an old bone and carrying who knows what, dust from the road, pollen from the fields, a fine grit of the world. Now, your lungs are not built for that air. Way down at the bottom of the lungs, where the real business happens, where oxygen slips across into the blood, the walls are thinner than tissue paper, kept at body temperature, kept perfectly moist, a warm, wet inner surface as tender as anything you own. Send raw, cold, dry, gritty air straight down onto that surface, and it is like leaving the good silverware out in a hailstorm. It is the wrong environment entirely. So the nose fixes the air on the way in. First it filters it. Just inside the nostrils there is a little palisade of hairs, coarse ones, that catch the big pieces of grit before they get any further, the way a screen door keeps the moths out. And past the hairs, the whole inside of the nose is lined with a film of sticky mucus, a slow-moving flypaper coating that traps the finer dust, the pollen, the small unwanted travelers, and holds them so they never reach the lungs at all. Then the nose warms it. The inside of the nose is not a smooth open tube. It is folded, crumpled, elaborate, full of curling shelves of tissue that the anatomists gave lovely scroll-like names, and those folds are richly supplied with warm blood running just beneath the surface. So the air, weaving its way through all those warm, wet passages, cannot help but pick up heat. Cold air comes in the nostril and arrives at the back of the throat already close to the warmth of your body. Gentled, tempered, brought up to the temperature of the house before it is let into the good rooms. And third, the nose wets it. That same moist lining gives up a little of its water to the passing air, so that dry desert air comes in one end and leaves the nose humid and soft, carrying its own fog, ready to be kind to those tissue paper walls below. Filtered, warmed, moistened. 3 gifts given freely on every single breath, and given so quietly that you have taken every one of them for granted your whole life, and every one of them is skipped entirely the moment you open your mouth and pull the air straight down past your teeth. The mouth is a shortcut, and like most shortcuts, it saves you a little effort now and charges you for it later. Air through the mouth arrives at the throat still cold, still dry, still carrying whatever it was carrying, dumped raw onto surfaces that would much rather have had the nose's help. I want to be careful here and not overpromise, because this part of the story is more plain observation than deep measured science, and I will not dress it up as more than it is. But you do not need a laboratory to notice that the mouth breather wakes with a throat like sandpaper and a tongue like a dry riverbed, while the nose breather does not. The workshop was closed all night. Nobody warmed the air, nobody wet it, nobody stood at the screen door, and so the tongue, by the simple act of sealing the mouth and insisting the traffic go the long way round through the nose, is not merely raising the resistance and slowing you down. It is routing every breath through the workshop instead of the shortcut. It is making sure the air gets filtered and warmed and moistened before it ever touches the tender country below. One small muscle pressed to the roof of the mouth, and the whole climate of the incoming air is quietly decided. Keep that in your mind, this idea of the nose as a workshop the mouth does not have. Because we are about to meet a man who closed his own workshop down on purpose, plugged it shut with silicone, and wrote down day by day exactly what it cost him. So let me tell you about this man, this journalist, who did a thing that most sensible people would never do to themselves. His name is James Nestor, and he arranged to have his experiment run at Stanford, working alongside a nose doctor, a rhinologist, Dr. Jayakar Nayak. And the design of the thing is so beautifully simple that you could almost sketch it on the back of an envelope. 2 blocks of time, 10 days each. In the first block, he shut the workshop down. He took soft silicone plugs and pushed them up into both nostrils, sealed them tight, and then, to be sure not a whisper of air sneaked through, he taped over the whole business. For 10 days and 10 nights this man could only breathe through his mouth. There was no other door. Whatever the mouth root does to a body, he was going to feel the full weight of it, around the clock, awake and asleep, with instruments watching. Now picture living that way. Every breath, day and night, drawn straight past the open mouth into the throat, skipping the warming, skipping the wetting, skipping the filtering, skipping the whole quiet chemistry we have been talking about for the last while. And they measured him. That is the part that lifts this out of anecdote and gives it at least a little spine. They did not just ask him how he felt, though I imagine he could have told you plenty. They put numbers on it. His blood pressure climbed. The top number, the systolic pressure, the push of blood against the walls of the arteries at the peak of each heartbeat, went up. And when they tracked his sleep during that mouth-breathing stretch, they counted the little suffocations, the moments where the breathing stumbles and stalls in the night, and they logged something like 25 of those events every single night. 25 times a night, his sleeping body lost the thread of a clean, easy breath. Remember our 12 sleepers, wired up, with their 43 stumbles an hour on the oral route against 1.5 on the nose? This is one man living it for 10 days and his own body drifting the same direction. Not a controlled laboratory breath through a mask for one night. 10 nights of it, as a way of life. And then, after those 10 days, they pulled the plugs. They peeled the tape, they opened the workshop back up, and for the next 10 days he was forbidden the shortcut. Nose only. Mouth sealed, in fact, at night, taped gently shut, so that even in his sleep the traffic had to go the long way round through the nose, through the warming and the wetting and the filtering and the little factory making its gas. Now what happened to the numbers when the door reopened? His systolic blood pressure, that top number, came down. It settled to somewhere around 124, and to feel the size of that you have to know where it had been, up around 142. That is not a rounding error. That is not the sort of wobble you shrug off. That is the difference between a pressure a doctor frowns at and a pressure a doctor nods at. Simply by changing which door the air came through, the pressure in his pipes fell by nearly 20 points. His heart got more supple too, and here I have to explain what I mean, because it sounds like poetry and it is actually a measurement. There is a thing called heart rate variability. You might think a healthy heart ticks like a perfect metronome, the same gap between every beat, tick, 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 even as a drum. It is exactly the opposite. A healthy, relaxed heart is a little jazzy. The spacing between one beat and the next is always shifting by tiny amounts, breathing in, breathing out, the nervous system loosening and tightening the reins moment by moment. When that variability is high, it usually means the calming branch of your nervous system, the part that rests and digests and lets the shoulders drop, has a good strong hand on the reins. When the variability goes flat and rigid, it often means you are stuck in the wound-up, ready-to-run state. And during his nose-breathing block, that variability rose by more than 150%. His heart went from marching to swinging. The rider on the reins loosened up, and his blood carbon dioxide rose, roughly 30% over where it had sat during the mouth-breathing days. Now, if you had come to this fresh, with the tidy schoolroom story in your head, you would read that line and think something had gone wrong. Carbon dioxide up. Isn't that the waste? The exhaust? The thing we are desperate to be rid of? But you and I, we have already done the work on this one. We already sat with the Bohr effect and watched the hemoglobin loosen its grip and hand the oxygen down into the working tissue precisely because the carbon dioxide was there to nudge it loose. So when his carbon dioxide came up on the nasal route, that is not the sound of a body drowning in its own exhaust. That is the sound of a body settling back toward the slightly richer, slightly slower balance that pries the oxygen loose where it is actually needed. The nasal route, with its honest resistance, kept a little more of the gas around, and the chemistry rewarded him for it. Now I want to be square with you, the way I would want somebody to be square with me. This is one man. This is a sample of one. In the trade, we would call it an anecdote wearing a lab coat, and we would be right to. You cannot take a single body, run it through 2 10-day stretches, and declare a law of nature. Maybe he slept differently for reasons that had nothing to do with his nose. Maybe knowing what he expected to find nudged the whole thing. One person is not proof. I would be lying to you and betraying the whole spirit of the thing if I told you this settled the question. It does not settle anything. What it does is something humbler and still worth having. It takes all the cold machinery we have been building, the resistance and the fourth power, the gas from the sinuses, the Bohr trade, the reflex in the muscle, and it wraps it around one living person for 20 days. And the direction that person drifts is the same direction all our machinery pointed. The story and the numbers agree. That is not proof. But when the careful control studies and the messy real-life experiment both lean the same way, you start to feel you are onto something true, rather than merely tidy. And here is what I find so quietly striking about his 20 days. He did not take a drug. He did not have an operation. Nobody rebuilt him. The only variable he changed was which opening the air went through. Everything else about him was the same man. Same lungs, same heart, same blood. He just moved the door. And the whole weather system of his body, the pressure in his arteries, the swing in his pulse, the balance of gas in his blood, the calm or the chaos of his nights, all of it shifted with that one change. That is the thing to carry forward, not the exact numbers which belong to him and might belong to nobody else. The lesson is that the root is not a trivial detail. The root is a lever. And the little muscle we started with, the tongue, is the hand that decides whether that lever is thrown toward the long way or the short way, all day and all night, without your ever giving it a thought. So we have gone a long way from where we started, from you noticing where your tongue was sitting a couple of hours ago. We built the gate. We built the pipe that punishes small changes so cruelly, the fourth power that turns a hair's width into a mountain of effort. We wired up the sleepers and watched the resistance more than double and the stumbles multiply 30-fold. We found the secret factory in the walls of the skull, quietly breathing out its ribbon of gas that opens the vessels in the lungs. We hummed and watched that ribbon swell 15 times over. We made the strange trade with carbon dioxide and got more oxygen for our tissues, not less, by breathing as though we had somewhere calm to be. We caught the tongue in the act of being a muscle, answering the suck of each breath by stiffening and holding the road open. And now we have watched one stubborn man live the whole argument out on his own body for 20 days. And there is one layer left. It is the slowest one, and in some ways the most astonishing, because it does not happen over a night or over 20 days. It happens over years. It happens so slowly that nobody in the house ever sees it happening. We have talked about what the tongue does to a single breath, and what a root does to a single night, and what a season of nights does to a man's blood pressure. But if you let the tongue rest low, breath after breath, night after night, through all the years when a body is still soft and still growing and still deciding what shape it is going to be, then something happens that is far harder to undo than a stiff morning or a high reading on a cuff. The air root, repeated 10,000 and 10,000 and 10,000 times, begins, very gently, to carve the bone itself. The face, quite literally, grows into the shape the breathing asks for. And to see that, we are going to lay 2 trays of pictures side by side, pictures made of X-rays of the hidden architecture inside the head, and we are going to measure the difference between a face that grew up breathing through its nose and a face that grew up breathing through its mouth. So picture the room. It is quiet, a little dim, the way rooms with light boxes on the wall tend to be. On one tray you have 20 pictures of young people, ages 9 to 25, who grew up breathing through the nose, the tongue up where it belongs, the mouth sealed most of the time. On the other tray, 20 pictures of young people the same ages, matched carefully so the only thing really different between the 2 groups is the habit, the route the air took, year after year. And you would think, wouldn't you, that a thing as gentle as breathing, a thing you cannot even feel, could not possibly leave a mark on bone. Bone feels so permanent. It is the part of us that lasts, the part that turns up in the ground long after everything soft is gone. And yet, let me tell you what they measured, because it is the measuring that makes it real. They took a length in the roof of the mouth from a little landmark at the front called the anterior nasal spine back to one at the rear called the posterior nasal spine. It is roughly the length of the upper jaw, the maxilla, the bony floor of the nose and roof of the mouth all at once. In the nose breathers, that length came out at about 55.2 millimeters. In the mouth breathers, about 51.5 millimeters. Now that is not a big number. That is less than 4 millimeters, less than the width of a pencil, the kind of difference you would never see across a dinner table. But it is there again and again, group against group, and it points in one direction. The upper jaw of the mouth breather is shorter. It did not grow out as far, and there is more. Because a jaw is not just a length, it is an angle, it is a position, it is how the whole middle of the face is carried forward or held back. They measured a thing the dentists call the SNA angle, which is a way of asking in numbers how far forward the upper jaw sits relative to the base of the skull. In the nose breathers, it was about 82.85 degrees. In the mouth breathers, about 80.5 degrees. Smaller. And a smaller angle here means the upper jaw is set back a little, retruded is the word they use, tucked in rather than reaching forward. The whole midface, ever so slightly, has fallen behind where it might have been. Then they looked at the lower jaw, at the corner of it, back near the ear, where the horizontal part that carries your teeth turns upward to meet the joint. That corner has an angle too, the gonial angle. In the nose breathers, about 125 degrees. In the mouth breathers, about 130 degrees. The jaw has swung open a little, hinged down and back, the corner spread wider. And if you have been listening to the whole of this talk, you already know why that would be, don't you? Because a jaw that hangs open to let air through the mouth is a jaw held, night after night, in a slightly dropped position, and a young bone does not fight the position it is held in for years. It settles into it. It grows to fit. The base of the skull itself, the front part of it, came out shorter in the mouth breathers too. And here is the one that ties the whole ribbon around the package. The one that brings us all the way back to the very first thing we noticed about the tongue as a gate. They measured the width of the airway itself, the pharynx, the soft tube at the back of the throat that all the air has to pass through on its way down, the upper part of it and the lower part of it, both. And in the mouth breathers, both were narrower. Not by a little maybe it is nothing amount either. The statisticians have a way of asking whether a difference could just be luck, could just be the roll of which 20 people you happen to pick, and they put a number on that chance. When that number is very small, less than 1 in 1,000, they write it down as p less than 0.001, and what they mean is, this is not luck, this is real. This is the world telling you something. And that is what they found for the airway width. The mouth breathers had measurably narrower throats, and the odds of that being an accident were less than 1 in 1,000. Now sit with that for a moment, because the shape of it is almost too neat. Remember Posui? Remember the pipe that punishes small changes, the radius raised to the 4th power, the doubling of width that cuts the resistance 16 times over. A narrower throat is a higher resistance, harder to pull air through. And here is a body that, because it breathed through its mouth, grew a narrower throat, which makes it harder still to breathe, which pushes it further toward the mouth, which holds the jaw open a little more, which narrows the throat a little more. Do you see the wheel turning? The habit carves the bone, and the carved bone deepens the habit. It is a loop that closes on itself and tightens very slowly over the years when a face is being decided. I want to be honest with you about what this does and does not prove, because that honesty is the whole game. These are pictures taken at one moment, 20 and 20, a snapshot, not a movie. Nobody filmed a single child's skull bending over a decade. What we have is 2 groups that ended up different, and a very good story about why. And the story hangs together beautifully with everything else we know, with the tongue as a scaffold, with the jaw that drops when the tongue slumps, with the resistance that rises when the airway narrows. But a snapshot of 2 groups can never, by itself, tell you for certain which way the arrow of cause points. Maybe some faces are simply born a little narrower, and the narrowness nudges them toward the mouth rather than the mouth carving the narrowness. Most likely it is both, each feeding the other, the loop I just described. The careful scientist holds those possibilities in the hand at the same time and does not squeeze them into one before the evidence is ready. But the direction of the whole picture, the way every separate measurement leans the same way, the jaw, the angle, the width, the base of the skull, all of them nodding toward the same conclusion, that is the kind of agreement that makes you sit up. Nature rarely lies to you in chorus. And think about the machinery that would make it possible. Because it is not magic, it is just pressure and time. A growing bone is not the dead white thing you imagine from a museum shelf. It is alive, it is busy, it is a construction site that never closes, cells laying down new bone on one surface while other cells quietly dissolve it away on another. It is always listening to the forces on it. Press on a bone steadily in one direction and it will, over months, remodel to meet that press. This is not a strange or special idea. It is the same reason the arm that swings a hammer all day grows a thicker shaft of bone than the arm that rests. It is the reason an astronaut, floating with no weight pushing down through the legs, comes home with lighter, thinner bones, because the press was gone and the bone stopped bothering to keep what it no longer needed. Bone is a negotiator. It gives you the shape your life keeps asking for. So now put the tongue back into that picture. A tongue held up against the roof of the mouth is a soft, steady, gentle press against the palate from below, all day, all night, for years. And the palate is not just the roof of your mouth, it is also the floor of your nose. The same shelf of bone. Press up on it, day after day, while it is still young and still willing, and it stays broad and flat and high, and the nasal floor above it stays wide, and the airway stays open. Take that press away, let the tongue fall to the floor of the mouth, and the palate loses the one thing that was gently shaping it from underneath. Nothing holds the roof up and out, and so it can grow narrower and higher, more of a vault than a broad arch, and the floor of the nose above it narrows to match. The tongue, in other words, is the mold. It is the quiet thumb pressing on the clay from the inside while the clay is still soft. And whether that thumb is there or not there, breath after breath, for the 15 or 20 years it takes to build a face, turns out to matter in a way you can lay on a light box and measure with a ruler. There is something almost dizzying in that, when you let it land, that the little muscle you were not even thinking about at the start of this talk, the one you can move right now without asking anyone's permission, is not only steering the air of this single breath, and not only setting the resistance of tonight's sleep, but was, long ago, one of the sculptors of the very face you carry. It worked in slow motion, so slowly you could never catch it in the act, a fraction of a millimeter a year. A press so soft you would swear it did nothing at all. And yet, across the long, patient arithmetic of childhood, that soft nothing added up to bone. The face grew into the shape the breathing asked for. The root wrote itself into the architecture, and the pen it used the whole time was the tongue. Let me sit with those measurements a little longer, because the numbers themselves have a quiet story in them, and I do not want to rush past it. When the people doing that study laid the two groups side by side, the mouth breathers and the nose breathers, and they put their rulers to the film, one of the things they measured was the length of the upper jaw. Front to back, from a little landmark of bone up under the nose to another one at the back of the palate. In the nose breathers, that length came out to about 55 millimeters. In the mouth breathers, it came out to about 51.5. Now 3.5 millimeters does not sound like much. It is a bit more than the thickness of 2 stacked pennies. You would never see it looking at a friend across a table. But that is the whole point of this kind of slow work. Nature does not announce it. It just quietly gives you a shorter upper jaw, and a shorter upper jaw has less room in it, and less room means the roof of your mouth sits differently, and the floor of your nose, which is the same piece of bone as the roof of your mouth, sits differently too. One ruler measurement, and you are already talking about the shape of the nasal floor. Then they measured an angle they call, in their shorthand, the SNA angle. Do not worry about the letters. It is just a way of asking how far forward the upper jaw sits relative to the base of the skull. Is the whole upper jaw parked out ahead, giving the face a full forward set, or is it pulled back, retruded, tucked in behind where you might expect it? In the nose breathers, that angle averaged a little under 83 degrees. In the mouth breathers, it averaged about 80.5. The upper jaw of the mouth breathers, on average, sat further back in the face. And here is the thing to feel in your body while I say it. The upper jaw is the front wall of the airway. Pull that wall backward, even a couple of degrees, and you have narrowed the room the air has to move through, up near the top, before it ever reaches the throat. The angle is small. The consequence is a pipe, and we already know what Saussure has to say about pipes. They looked at the jaw angle too, the one down at the back corner of the lower jaw, where the horizontal part that holds your bottom teeth turns upward toward the hinge by your ear. Anatomists call it the gonial angle, and it is just the openness of that corner. In the nose breathers, it was about 125 degrees. In the mouth breathers, it had opened out to 130. A more open corner there means the lower jaw has rotated, swung down and back, hanging a little more open, a little more slack. Which is exactly the posture you would predict, is it not, from everything we built earlier. Drop the tongue off the roof, let the mouth fall open to breathe, and you have asked the jaw to spend its growing years hanging in that open position. The bone does not fight you. The bone believes you. It grows into the angle you keep showing it. And then, at the end of all that measuring, they came to the passage itself. The pharyngeal airway. The actual clear space at the back of the throat where the air has to get through, and they found the mouth breathers had a narrower space, both up high and down low, and the difference was strong enough that the statisticians put their strongest little flag on it. When you see that flag, in the language they use, it means roughly this. If breathing root had nothing to do with airway width, if the whole thing were just chance, you would expect to stumble onto a gap this big less than 1 time in 1,000 tries. So it is not chance. It is a real difference, sitting right there in the bone and the soft tissue between the children who breathe one way and the children who breathe the other. Now I want to be honest with you the way I would want somebody to be honest with me, because it would be easy to take a study like that and swing it around like a hammer and claim more than it can hold. A study like this compares two groups and finds them different. It does not all by itself walk you step by step through the cause. You could stand up in the back of the room and say to me, "Professor, how do you know the breathing shaped the face?" Maybe the face came first. Maybe some of these children were born with a narrower upper jaw and a setback upper lip, and that cramped little nose is what pushed them to breathe through the mouth in the first place. And you would be right to say it. That is a real possibility, and an honest person leaves it on the table. The chicken and the egg are both in this hen house, and pointing at one film will not tell you which one clucked first. But here is why the breathing shapes bone story is not just a fairy tale, and why I lean toward it even while I keep my doubts. We do not only have the X-ray films, we have the mechanism, the whole chain of it, and we built that chain together tonight before we ever saw a skull. We know the tongue, pressed to the palate, puts a gentle outward pressure on the roof of the mouth. We know that roof is a young bone, and young bone is not marble, it is more like a slow, stiff clay that remembers the forces you lean on it with. We know that when the tongue drops away, that outward pressure vanishes, and the cheeks, pressing inward from the sides, no longer have anything pushing back against them from the middle. Squeeze from the sides with nothing bracing from within, and a widening arch becomes a narrowing one. You do not need a study to believe that a wall with a brace behind it and a wall without one will over years come to stand in different places. The film does not create the idea. The film agrees with an idea we already had good reason to hold. And when the mechanism and the measurement shake hands like that, you are allowed to believe them a little more than you would believe either one shouting on its own. There is a second reason I trust it, and it is the reason a physicist always trusts, which is that the direction of every effect points the same way. Think about what we have gathered, layer on layer all night. Drop the tongue and the resistance goes up. Drop the tongue and the mouth root opens and the sleeping airway collapses 40 times more often. Drop the tongue and you skip the gas the sinuses were quietly making for you. Drop the tongue and you purge away the very carbon dioxide that was helping you hand off oxygen. Drop the tongue and you switch off the little suction reflex that was stiffening the airway from within. Drop the tongue, and now the film says drop the tongue for 15 years, and the jaw itself grows backward and the throat grows narrower. Every single arrow points in the same direction. Not one of them points the other way. In physics, when every independent line of evidence leans the same way, you begin to suspect they are all leaning against the same true wall. It would be a strange and elaborate coincidence for 6 unrelated things to all conspire to make the same story look true if the story were false. And notice something about the shape of the whole picture now, something I find genuinely lovely to hold in the mind. The narrowing feeds itself. A child who breathes through the mouth grows a jaw that sits further back and a throat that runs narrower. But a jaw further back and a throat that runs narrower are exactly the conditions that make nose breathing harder and mouth breathing easier. So the shape the breathing built goes on to encourage more of the same breathing that built it. It is a loop that tightens its own knot. The root carves the architecture, and then the architecture defends the root. That is not a moral failing in anyone. Nobody chose it. It is just what happens when a soft daily habit gets to lean on growing bone for a decade and a half without anything interrupting it. The frightening part and the hopeful part are the same part. If a habit that gentle can tilt the whole structure one way, then the structure was never carved in stone to begin with. It was carved in the far slower, far kinder stuff of living tissue, which is always, in its patient way, still listening. I keep coming back all night to how small the input is at the front of this whole machine. We are not talking about some enormous force. We are talking about a tongue, weighing about as much as a small plum, resting or not resting against a ridge of bone the width of your thumb. That is the lever. And out the far end of the arithmetic come blood pressures and sleep events and the angle of a jaw and the width of the road your air travels for the rest of your life. The bigness of the outcome and the smallness of the cause do not match, and whenever they do not match like that, a physicist's ears go up, because it means there is amplification hiding somewhere in the middle. We have already met 3 of the amplifiers tonight. Poiseuille's fourth power, which takes a whisper of narrowing and returns a shout of resistance. Sleep, which strips away the waking reflexes that were papering over the problem. And time, 15 unhurried years of it, which takes a pressure too soft to feel and integrates it patiently into bone. Small cause, big effect, and 3 quiet multipliers standing in between. That is the real machinery of tonight's story, and once you see those 3, you can almost feel where the next surprise is going to come from before I even tell you. Let me hand you the next surprise then, the way you hand someone a tool they didn't know they were missing. Everybody I ever talked to about breathing believed the same comfortable thing, and it is such a natural thing to believe that I believed it too for a long while. The belief goes like this: air comes in, and air has oxygen in it, and oxygen is the good stuff, the thing that keeps the fire of you burning. So more air, faster air, bigger gulps of it must be better. If a little is good, a lot is better. Breathe deep, breathe hard, fill yourself up. It sounds like arithmetic. It sounds like it could not possibly be wrong. And yet it is wrong. And it is wrong in a way that took me by surprise the first time somebody walked me through it slowly. Because the thing that decides whether oxygen actually gets off the bus and into your muscle, into the tissue that needs it, is not how much oxygen you breathed in. Your blood, if you are healthy, is already almost completely loaded with oxygen after an ordinary quiet breath, nearly full. You cannot fill a cup that is already brimming by pouring harder. The bottleneck is somewhere else entirely, and that is the part nobody tells you. Here is where it hides. Oxygen rides through your blood clamped onto a molecule called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is a fickle little carrier. It picks oxygen up in the lungs, holds it tight while it travels, and then, when it arrives at some hungry muscle, it has to let go. The whole business only works if the carrier holds on at the start and releases at the finish. Picking up is easy. It is the letting go that turns out to be the delicate, decisive act. And what tells hemoglobin to let go, to loosen its grip and drop its cargo right where the tissue needs it, is not oxygen at all. It is carbon dioxide. It is the very gas you have spent your whole life thinking of as nothing but waste, nothing but exhaust, the smoke you want to get rid of as fast as you can. Sit with that for a moment, because it turns the story inside out. The waste gas is the signal. When a muscle is working hard, it makes carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide makes the blood around it a touch more acidic, and that faint sourness is exactly the message that pries hemoglobin's fingers open. More carbon dioxide means more oxygen released, right there, right where the work is happening. The tissue orders its own delivery in its own private language, and the word it uses is the word you are trying to throw away. A Danish physiologist named Bohr worked this out a very long time ago, around the turn of the century, and we still call the effect by his name. Rising carbon dioxide, falling acidity, and the whole relationship between blood and oxygen slides over so that the oxygen comes off more readily into the tissue that is asking for it. Now watch what that does to the comfortable belief. If you breathe fast and hard through a wide open mouth, huffing away, you feel like you are doing something virtuous. You feel like you are flooding yourself with the good stuff. But what you are actually doing is blowing off carbon dioxide faster than your body makes it. You are throwing away the signal. You are scrubbing out the very messenger whose whole job is to tell your blood to unload. Your blood stays loaded, brimming, saturated, and useless, because nothing is telling it to let go. You can end up with plenty of oxygen in the pipe and less of it reaching the muscle. It is like a delivery truck driving past every house on the street, full to the roof, because nobody rang to place an order. And the nose, the quiet, resisted, slightly effortful nose, does the opposite. It slows you down. It makes each breath a little bit of work, a little bit against the wall, and because of that you do not over-purge. You hold a touch more carbon dioxide in the blood than the mouth breather does. Not a dangerous amount, just enough. Just enough to keep the signal warm, to keep hemoglobin generous, to keep the oxygen coming off where it is wanted. The breathing that feels slightly harder delivers more, not less. The resistance is not the price you pay. The resistance is part of the gift. I find that genuinely one of the loveliest reversals in all of physiology, because it takes the thing that feels like a nuisance, the friction, the little effort, and reveals it as the mechanism. So now line them up. The 2 roads for the air. The mouth road is wide and easy, and it lets you dump carbon dioxide fast, and it feels like power, and it starves the delivery. The nose road is narrow, and it makes you work a whisper harder, and it keeps the messenger in play, and it feeds the tissue. And which road the air takes is decided, we keep coming back to it, by that small wet muscle sitting in the dark, either pressed up against the roof and sealing the wide road shut, or slumped low and leaving it wide open. The tongue is not just closing a door. The tongue is choosing which chemistry your blood will run. Let me push on that tongue now, because I have been letting you picture it as a lump. A soft thing that either lies here or lies there, passive, along for the ride. That picture is going to fail you, and I want to break it gently before it breaks on its own. Because the tongue is a muscle, a big one of the strongest for its size in the whole body, and muscles do not just sit. They act, they respond. And this one responds to something you would never guess it could even feel. Think about what happens inside your throat the instant you begin to draw a breath. Your chest expands, your diaphragm drops, and that makes the space inside your airway want to grow, which means the air in there thins out just slightly, which means the pressure drops. For a fraction of a second as you start to inhale, the inside of your upper airway is at a lower pressure than the room. It is a gentle suck, a soft negative pressure, pulling inward on the soft walls of your throat. And soft walls under suction want to collapse. A wet paper straw, sucked too hard, pinches flat. Your airway has that same temptation built into it, every single time you breathe in. So there is a problem sitting right at the heart of ordinary breathing. The very act of pulling air in tends to pull your airway shut. And nature, which has had a long time to notice this problem, built a guard against it. And the guard is your tongue. Buried in the base of the tongue is a muscle whose fibers, when they fire, pull the whole tongue forward and stiffen it, hauling it away from the back wall of the throat and holding the airway open. And here is the beautiful part. That muscle has a reflex wired to the suction itself. When the pressure in the airway drops, when that little inward pull begins, the muscle answers, fast, without you deciding anything, without you knowing anything. Researchers have measured it directly. Send a brief pulse of negative pressure into the nose of a wide-awake, healthy person, a gentle suck of just a few units of water pressure, and within a blink, the electrical activity in that tongue muscle jumps. The tongue tenses and reaches forward to brace the airway open in the very moment the breath is trying to pull it shut. So the tongue is not lying there. The tongue is standing guard. Every inhalation is a tiny contest between the suck that would collapse your throat and the reflex that stiffens the tongue to hold it open, and while you are awake and healthy, you win that contest so easily, so many thousands of times a day, that you never once feel it happening. It is one of those countless small competences your body performs in the dark, keeping the road open breath after breath and asking nothing of you, not even your attention. But now you can feel the next surprise coming, the way I promised you would. Because I have just told you the tongue's protective reflex is most alive when you are awake. And we have already spent a whole night watching what happens when the waking guards go off duty. When you fall asleep, the reflexes soften. The tongue's grip loosens. The muscle that was bracing the airway open all day relaxes, and the same suck that it used to shrug off can now, with nothing pushing back, begin to draw the walls together. The guard has gone home, and into that undefended hour walks the very geometry we started with, Posuya's cruel fourth power, waiting to turn a little narrowing into a lot of resistance the instant no muscle is holding the road wide. You see how the pieces are starting to reach for each other across the whole evening. The seal at the front, the fourth power in the pipe, the chemistry in the blood, the reflex in the muscle, the surrender of sleep. None of them is the story by itself. Each one is a strand. And the strands are twisting together now into a rope, and the rope runs from that small movement of your tongue, the one you made or did not make an hour ago when I first asked, all the way out to the shape of a night, the pressure of your blood, and, though you may not believe it yet, the shape of a face. Let me keep pulling the strands together, and let us go next to the workshop your air walks through when it takes the narrow road, the little factory in your nose that the mouth breather passes by without a glance. Picture the air outside on a cold morning. It is dry, and it is dirty, and it is cold, and it does not care about you at all. It is just gas, moving where the pressure tells it to move. Now that gas has two doors it might walk through to get into you. One door is the mouth, which is a short, wide hallway straight down. No ceremony, no inspection. The other door is the nose, which is not really a hallway at all. It is more like a set of narrow, winding corridors with warm, wet walls, folded and curled so that the air cannot go straight through. Inside the nose there are these little scrolls of bone, curled like the shell of a snail, and they are draped in soft tissue that is soaked with moisture and threaded through with blood running close to the surface. The air has to squeeze and turn and brush along all of that on its way down, and every brush is a lesson. Think about what happens in that brush. The cold air comes in, and the warm, wet walls are right there against it, and heat moves from the wall into the air the way heat always moves, from the warmer thing to the cooler thing without being asked. By the time that air has wound its way through the corridors and reached the back of your throat, it is not cold anymore. It has been carried up close to the temperature of your body, gently, over a distance of only a few centimeters. That is a little furnace you did not know you were running, and it runs on the plain physics of two things at different temperatures touching each other. And it is not only warming. The walls are wet, and dry air passing over a wet surface picks up water, the way a breeze passing over a lake carries some of the lake away with it. So the air arrives not just warm, but damp, moistened, made soft. Your lungs down at the bottom are delicate wet things. They want their air warm and they want it humid, because they are going to hand its oxygen across a film of moisture into your blood, and dry cold air is hard on that film. The nose does the softening ahead of time, so the lungs never have to meet the weather directly. There is filtering too. Those winding corridors are lined with fine hairs near the front and with a thin coat of sticky mucus deeper in, and the sticky coat is always creeping slowly, carried along by millions of tiny beating hairs too small to see, sweeping debris toward the throat to be swallowed and dealt with. So the dust, the bits of pollen, the specks of soot floating in that morning air, a great many of them never make it past the nose. They get caught on the flypaper and hauled away. The air that finally reaches your lungs has been strained. Now here is the quiet point I want you to sit with. Every one of those surfaces, the warming, the wetting, the straining, happens only if the air takes the narrow, winding road through the nose. Send the air down the short, wide hallway of the mouth instead, and it skips the whole workshop. It arrives cold, it arrives dry, it arrives carrying whatever it was carrying. The lungs meet the weather with nothing in between. And what decides which road the air takes? We are back where we began. It is the seal at the front of the mouth. It is where your tongue is resting. Lift the tongue to the roof, close the front door, and the air is routed through the workshop whether it likes it or not. Let the tongue fall, let the mouth fall open, and the air takes the lazy road and skips the inspection every single time. I want to be honest with you about the strength of what I am saying here, because a good scientist tells you how sure he is, not just what he thinks. The warming and the wetting and the filtering, these are not controversial. You can feel them. Breathe in through your nose on a frosty day and then through your mouth, and you will feel the difference at the back of your throat directly, the mouth breath colder and sharper. That much is plain. Whether skipping the workshop night after night, year after year, adds up to something that matters for your health, that is a bigger claim, and the evidence there is softer, and I will treat it as softer. But the physics of the single breath is solid. Warm meets cold and shares its heat. Dry meets wet and steals some water. Moving air meets sticky wall and drops its cargo. No mystery in any of it. Just the ordinary rules, doing ordinary work in a place you never look. Let me draw one more thread out of this before we move on, because it connects the workshop back to something we already built. Remember the pipe that punishes small changes, the resistance that climbs with the fourth power of any narrowing. The nose is a narrow road on purpose. It costs a little more effort to pull air through those winding corridors than through the open mouth. You are paying for the warming and the wetting and the straining with a bit of extra work on every breath. And you might think, well, that is a bad trade. Why pay more? But hold that thought, because we have already seen that breathing that costs a little more, that goes a little slower against a little resistance, is exactly the breathing that lets the blood hold on to more of its carbon dioxide, And that carbon dioxide, through the trick we talked about with the hemoglobin loosening its grip, is what pries the oxygen loose where the tissues need it. So the extra cost of the narrow road is not waste. It is buying two things at once. It buys you the warm, clean, humid air, and it buys you the slow, steady rhythm that delivers oxygen better. The wide-mouth road is cheaper by the breath and poorer by the hour. You begin to see why I keep saying none of these strands is the whole rope. If I had only told you about the workshop, the warming, and the wedding, you might have shrugged and said, "So what, my throat can take a little cold air." If I had only told you about the carbon dioxide, you might have said, "That is just chemistry. What has it to do with me?" But lay them side by side, the seal and the fourth power, and the sleeping bodies wired to their instruments, and the little factory making its gas, and the humming that pours out 15 times more of it, and the blood loosening its grip, and the workshop straining the air, and now the same small thing, the position of your tongue, is reaching into all of them at once. That is what makes it worth 3 hours of a quiet evening. Not any single fact. The way the facts are all secretly holding hands behind the curtain. And I have been saving something. All through this talk I have been dealing in generalities in what tends to happen in 12 sleeping adults and 10 humming subjects. Groups of people averaged together. That is how we do careful science, because one person could always be a fluke. But there is a kind of evidence that has a different flavor, that grabs you by the collar in a way the averages do not, and that is when one stubborn person straps the instruments to himself and does the thing to his own body and writes down what happens, day by day. It is not proof. One person is one person, and one person who wanted a particular answer is worth being suspicious of. But as a way of feeling in your gut what these numbers might mean, of watching the whole rope pull tight on a single human being, there is nothing quite like it. So let me tell you about a man who plugged his own nose shut with silicone for 10 days on purpose, walked around like that, slept like that, and measured himself the entire time, and then pulled the plugs out and did the opposite for 10 days more. Let me tell you what the instruments said about him, and let me be careful, as we go, to tell you exactly how much of it we should believe and how much we should hold at arm's length. Because the story is striking, and striking stories are the ones you most need to keep your head about. He did this at a laboratory at Stanford, working alongside a nose doctor, a rhinologist, so that the measurements would be taken properly and not just by a man guessing about himself in a bathroom mirror. For the first 10 days, he wore the silicone plugs, sealing the nose completely, forcing every breath he took, waking and sleeping, to go down that short, wide hallway of the mouth. And then for the next 10 days, he did the reverse. He breathed only through his nose, taping the mouth at night so it could not fall open while he slept, sending every breath the long winding way through the workshop. Same man, same body, same food and rooms and habits as much as he could manage. Only the road the air took was changed. 2 10-day chapters and a stack of numbers at the end of each one, waiting to be compared. And here is what those 2 stacks of numbers said, and I want you to listen to them the way you would listen to a rumor from a friend you trust but who tends to get excited. During the 10 days of the mouth, the days of the plugged nose, the pressure in his arteries, the top number, the one they call systolic, climbed. His nights broke apart. The little monitor he wore counted something like 25 stoppages a night, 25 moments where the breathing faltered and caught, 25 small interruptions in the smooth machinery of sleep. Then he pulled the plugs. 10 days of the nose, mouth taped gently shut at night. And the top number in his arteries came down to somewhere near 124 from a starting place up around 142. That is not a small drift. That is the difference between a doctor frowning at you and a doctor nodding. The steadiness of his heartbeat, the way the gaps between beats varied from one moment to the next, which is a quiet sign of a nervous system at ease, that measure rose by more than 1.5 times what it had been. And the carbon dioxide in his blood, the very gas we spent so long learning to respect, that rose by something like 1/3. Now I told you to hold this at arm's length, and I meant it, so let me tell you exactly how far out to hold it. This is one man, one body, one set of habits, one stretch of 20 days. In the whole enterprise of figuring out how nature works, A single person measured across a single stretch of time is the very faintest kind of evidence there is. It is a story, not a law. He could have been sleeping badly for reasons that had nothing to do with the plugs. He could have been eating differently without noticing. He knew which chapter he was in, and a man who knows what he expects to find has a way of nudging the world toward it without meaning to. All of those doubts are real, and you should keep them. But here is why the story is still worth telling, even after we have subtracted all the credit it does not deserve. It points in the same direction as everything else we have built up, layer by layer, this whole long evening. The sleeping 12 with their resistances, the little pipe and its fourth power, the gas made in the sinuses, the bending curve of the blood, every one of those was measured coldly, in people who could not fool themselves, and every one of them says the same thing the one man's 20 days say. When several careful cold measurements and one warm doubtful story all lean the same way, the story stops being proof and becomes something better. It becomes an illustration, a face you can put on the numbers. And people remember faces. So let us set the one man down gently and turn to the thing I have been keeping just out of sight this whole time. The shape on the far horizon I promised you at the very beginning and then refused to explain. Because everything up to now has been about a single breath or a single night. The seal, the pipe, the gas, the curve, the reflex, the workshop, the man, all of them live inside minutes and hours. But the tongue does something slower than that, something you cannot feel happening, the way you cannot feel your fingernails growing, the way you cannot watch the hour hand move. It bills. Picture two trays laid side by side on a table, the kind of table where a doctor spreads out pictures to study them. On each tray, a set of X-ray photographs of the human head taken from the side so that you are looking at the skull in profile, the way you would draw a face for a coin. On one tray, 20 of them. On the other tray, 20 more. The people photographed ran from about 9 years old up to about 25. Children and young adults and everything in between. The two trays are not random. One tray holds 20 people who all through their growing years breathed mostly through the mouth. The other holds 20 who breathe through the nose. And the question the scientists were asking is the simplest and strangest question in this whole talk. Not, how do you breathe right now? But rather, does the way you have breathed for years leave a mark you can measure in bone? Before I tell you what they found, let me convince you the question is not crazy, because at first it sounds crazy. Bone feels like the most permanent thing about us. It is what is left when everything else is gone. It is the part of a person that outlasts the person. So the idea that the soft, wet muscle of the tongue could push it around seems like the idea that a breeze could move a mountain, but you already know it is not crazy, because you have watched it in gentler places. You have seen how a path across a lawn appears where people walk not because anyone dug it, but because 1,000 soft footsteps, none of them strong enough to matter alone, together wore the grass away. You have seen how a rope laid over the edge of a stone bridge, pulled a little every day by the water underneath, will in 100 years cut a groove in the stone. The stone did not lose to the rope in any single moment. It lost to the rope times all the days. Bone is like that. Bone is not a finished statue. Bone is a slow river of tissue, forever being taken away in one spot and laid down in another, listening the whole time to the forces pressing on it. Push on it steadily, patiently for years, and it will yield. And the tongue, pressed to the roof of the mouth, is exactly such a patient push. It sits against the palate hour after hour, night after night, from childhood on, gently spreading the upper jaw outward and holding it broad, the way a hand held inside a mitten keeps the mitten's shape. Take the hand out of the mitten, and the mitten goes slack. Take the tongue off the palate, and the roof of the mouth loses its steady sculptor. So now you are ready for what the two trays showed, and it is worth telling slowly, because the measurements are precise, and precision is a kind of honesty. The scientists laid their rulers and their angles across the photographs, using landmarks in the skull that anatomists have agreed on for a long time. Fixed points you can find again and again in different people so that your comparisons mean something. And the upper jaw of the mouth breathers, measured front to back along its bony floor, came out shorter. something like 51.5 millimeters against something like 55 in the nose breathers. 3.5 millimeters give or take. You could hide that distance under a fingernail. And yet across 20 faces and 20 faces it held up as a real and steady difference, not a fluke of one odd skull. They measured an angle too, an angle that tells you how far forward the upper jaw sits under the rest of the face. In the nose breathers that angle sat a touch under 83 degrees. In the mouth breathers it had slipped down toward 80.5, which means, in plain language, the upper jaw had drifted a little backward, tucked itself a little further under the brow, retreated, and the angle of the lower jaw, the corner at the back where the jaw turns up toward the ear, that had opened wider in the mouth breathers, something near 130 degrees against 125. A wider angle there means a jaw hung a little more open, a little more down and back, the face grown longer and slacker rather than square and forward. The base of the skull itself, the bony shelf the whole face is built upon, came out shorter in front. And then the measurement that pulls this whole evening's thread tight, the one you should have felt coming from the very first layer. The width of the airway itself, the space in the throat behind the tongue where all our air must pass, was narrower in the mouth breathers. Narrower up high and narrower down low. And not by a whisker of chance either. The scientists mark how sure they are with a little number, and the little number here said the odds of this being an accident were less than 1 in 1,000. Sit with that a moment, because a circle has just closed and I want you to hear it click. We began the evening with a pipe, and a law that said the narrowness of a pipe punishes you not a little but enormously by the fourth power of the squeezing. A passage half as wide costs you 16 times the effort to pull air through. And now, at the far end of the evening, we find that years of breathing through the mouth, years of the tongue lying low and idle instead of pressed to the roof, actually narrow the pipe, not the muscle around it in the moment. The bone. The permanent architecture. The mouth breather does not merely breathe harder tonight. He slowly builds himself a narrower throat to breathe through tomorrow, and the narrower throat makes the hard breathing harder still, which keeps the mouth falling open, which keeps the tongue off the roof, which keeps the jaw from being sculpted broad. It is a wheel that turns itself, a groove that deepens under its own rope, and the same wheel, spun the other way, in the child whose tongue rides high and whose nose does the breathing, widens the jaw, holds the airway open, makes the nose the easy road, and keeps the tongue where it belongs. The posture writes the bone, and the bone invites the posture, around and around, across all the years of a growing face. I am careful here, and you should be too, because a photograph of a skull cannot tell you which came first. It cannot walk you backward through those 20 childhoods and show you the tongue slipping down before the jaw grew long rather than after. Maybe some of these faces were built narrow first, by the accident of birth, and the mouth breathing came trailing behind as a consequence. The chicken and the egg stand very close together in a still X-ray. But we are not holding the X-ray by itself. We are holding it at the end of a long chain, each link forged separately, each one pointing the same way, and a conclusion resting on many independent links is a far sturdier thing than one resting on a single beam. Let me lay those links out on the table where you can see them, one beside the other, the way you might lay out the parts of a clock before you decide whether it can really keep time. The first link is the seal itself, the plain mechanics of a tongue pressed to the roof of the mouth, closing the easy road through the lips and leaving only the road through the nose. That link owes nothing to any of the others. It is just geometry and suction, a soft lid on a soft box. The second link is that cruel little law of the pipe, the resistance climbing with the fourth power of the narrowing, so that a passage squeezed even a little makes the breath work far harder than you would ever guess. That link is pure physics. It would be true of water in a garden hose, of oil in a machine, of air in a flute. It does not care one whit about tongues. And yet it points the same way, because it tells you that where the tongue holds the throat open, the breathing is cheap, and where the tongue slumps and the throat narrows, the breathing turns expensive. The third link came from the sleepers, the dozen of them wired up in the dark, breathing first through the nose and then through the mouth. And the machines patiently reporting that the mouth road cost more than twice the resistance and turned a quiet hour into an hour with dozens of little collapses. That link is a a number pulled straight out of a living throat at night, and it agrees with the law of the pipe without being told to. The fourth link is that strange gas the sinuses make and hand to you free with every nasal breath, the one the open mouth never gets to inhale, the little whisper that tells the lungs' own blood vessels to open wider and drink more deeply. The fifth link is the hum that lifts that gas 15 times over, proof that the nose is not a dead corridor, but a chamber that answers to how you move the air through it. The sixth link is the quiet bargain of the carbon dioxide, the way a breath that feels a touch harder can loosen the grip of the blood on its oxygen and let the tissue take more, not less. And the seventh link is the muscle of the tongue itself catching the suck of each inhale and stiffening against it, a living beam that props the airway open just when the air is trying to pull it shut. Now stand back and look. Not one of those links was forged in the same shop. The pipe law came from a Frenchman studying flow. The gas came from chemists chasing a molecule. The sleep numbers came from people watching the breath at night. The tongue reflex came from people poking gently at the pressure inside an awake throat and watching a muscle twitch in reply. They were never introduced to one another. They were never asked to agree, and they all leaned the same direction toward the same quiet conclusion that the road through the nose, held open by a tongue in its proper place, is the cheaper road, the warmer road, the road that hands you a free medicine and a better bargain on your oxygen. When many strangers, questioned separately, tell you the same story, you begin to trust the story. That is the whole trick of it. That is why the still X-ray, which by itself could only whisper about the chicken and the egg, gets to speak with a firmer voice once it is standing in that long line of witnesses. And here is a thing I want you to sit with, gently, without rushing to do anything about it. All of this machinery, the pipe and the gas and the muscle and the bone, all of it is running right now tonight, without asking your permission and without needing your attention. You did not sign up for it. You do not have to remember to keep the little nitric oxide factory in the sinuses running. You do not have to remind the genioglossus to catch the negative pressure and brace against it. The body has been doing the arithmetic of the fourth power of the radius in the dark for as long as there have been noses and throats, long before anyone wrote the law down or measured a single sleeper. What is remarkable, and I use that word carefully because it truly is worth remarking, is not that the body does this. It is that the smallest, dullest seeming detail, where a soft muscle happens to rest while you are thinking about something else entirely, sits at the top of the whole cascade, like the first stone that starts a long, slow slide down a hillside. Think of it the way you might think of a river deciding, at the very top of a mountain, which side of a ridge to fall down. Up there the choice is almost nothing. A pebble's width, one way or the other. A breath of wind. But that tiny choice at the crest decides whether the water ends in one ocean or another, 1,000 miles apart. The tongue, resting up or resting down, is a choice made at the crest. By itself it is nothing, a feather of pressure against the roof of the mouth, but it sits so near the top of the cascade that everything downstream inherits its direction. The route of the air, the resistance of the pipe, whether the gas gets inhaled, whether the carbon dioxide is overpurged or gently kept, and, given enough years and a young enough face, the very shape of the bone that houses all of it. A feather at the crest, an ocean at the bottom. I do not want you to hear in any of this a scolding, or a rule, or a thing you have been doing wrong all your life. That is not the spirit of it at all. Nature does not hand out grades. The point of understanding a machine is not to feel guilty about the machine. It is to feel the pleasure of seeing how the parts fit, of watching a dozen separate facts click together into one shape, the way a scattered pile of gears suddenly, when you turn the last one, all begin to move together and you realize you are holding a clock the whole time. There is a real delight in that, and it is a quieter delight than surprise. Surprise is loud. This is the slow, warm satisfaction of a thing making sense. And notice how ordinary the whole cast of characters is. Not a single exotic ingredient in the entire story. Air, which is free and everywhere. A tongue, which you have been carrying around your whole life without a second thought. A nose, which you mostly notice only when it is stuffed. A little bone box behind the cheeks, making a gasp by the same trick your body uses in 100 other quiet corners. Water vapor. a muscle, a pressure difference no greater than the weight of a few inches of water. From that plain, unglamorous heap of parts, the body assembles something with the finesse of a fine instrument, tuning the flow, dosing the gas, bracing the walls, all of it below the floor of your awareness. The grandeur here is not in any one piece. The grandeur is in the fitting together, in the fact that so many humble things conspire without conspiring to keep the breath easy and the tissue fed. Let me turn it once more in the light, because there is a symmetry in it that I find lovely. At the very small scale, we have a single molecule of gas drifting out of a sinus and riding the incoming breath down into the lung, where it nudges one blood vessel a little wider. At the very large scale, across a decade of a growing child, we have a whole skull being coaxed a fraction wider or narrower, a jaw growing forward or hanging back, a face taking its adult shape. And the same small actor, the tongue in its resting place, has a hand in both. It touches the fate of a single molecule on a single breath, and it touches the slow architecture of a face across 10,000 nights. The very small and the very large, both answering to the same soft muscle. It is not often you get to watch one humble thing reach across so many scales at once, and reach across them so quietly that almost no one ever notices it is happening. So we have climbed a fair way up this thing now, layer by patient layer, from the plain fact of a tongue against a ridge all the way to the shape of a growing skull. And I have been careful, I hope, to keep telling you where the ground is firm and where it is soft, which links are iron and which are only twine. But I have been holding one more idea in reserve, off to the side, because it is the sort of idea that changes how you feel the whole picture from the inside. It has to do with time, and with rhythm, and with what happens not over a single night or a single decade, but over the 800 million odd breaths of an ordinary life, each one a tiny vote, each one nudging the whole system one way or the other. And once you start counting in breaths instead of in years, some of what we have seen begins to look different again. Think for a moment about what a breath really is, viewed from far enough away. It is not a single event, it is a repeated one. And repeated things have a strange kind of power that single things do not, a power that has nothing to do with how big any one of them is. A single drop of water landing on a stone does nothing at all. You could watch it for an hour and swear the stone was eternal, but the same drop, falling in the same spot, over and over, patient beyond patience, will in the end wear a bowl into solid rock. Nothing in the drop changed. What changed was the count. And the count is the thing we almost never feel, because we live inside one breath at a time, and one breath at a time is where all our attention naturally sits. So let me try to make the count feel real to you, gently, the way you might turn a stone over in your hand in the dark. A person at rest breathes somewhere around 12 to 16 times a minute. Call it 14 to pick a plain middle number. 14 times a minute, 60 minutes an hour, and already you are at more than 800 breaths in a single hour, most of them completely beneath notice. Keep going. Through the whole waking day, through the whole sleeping night, and you land somewhere near 20,000 breaths before the sun comes up again. 20,000 small decisions, every single one of them routed either through the nose or through the mouth. Every single one of them either carrying that faint gift of manufactured gas from the sinuses or skipping it. Every single one of them either drawn slow through a resisting passage or gulped fast through an open one. And you did not decide any of them on purpose. Where your tongue was sitting decided most of them for you. Now stretch it out. 20,000 a day becomes something over 7 million in a year. 7 million in a year, carried across the length of an ordinary life, and you arrive at that number I set beside you a moment ago, somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 million breaths. I want you to sit with how odd that is. Not one of those breaths, taken alone, matters in the slightest. If you breathe one single breath through your mouth right now, nothing happens to you. Nothing measurable, nothing you could ever detect, nothing worth a moment's worry. The whole thing is beneath the threshold of consequence. And yet the sum of 800 million of them, each one leaning ever so slightly in the same direction, is a jaw that grew one shape rather than another, an airway that settled one width rather than another, a night's sleep that runs smooth rather than ragged. The consequence lives entirely in the repetition. It is invisible in the instant and undeniable in the total. That is the drop in the stone again, only now the stone is you. This, I think, is where people get fooled, and it is an honest kind of fooling, not a stupid one. We are built to notice the big single events. A loud noise, a bright flash, a sudden pain. Our attention is a hunter's attention, tuned to the thing that leaps. And a breath does not leap. A breath is the very opposite of a thing that leaps. It is the quietest, most repeated, most ignorable event in your entire body. So ignorable that the body took the trouble to run it automatically so your mind would never have to be bothered. So of course we miss it. We are looking for the leaping thing, and the breath just goes on, drumming its soft finger against the stone 20,000 times a day, asking nothing, announcing nothing, and slowly, slowly getting its way. And here is a piece of it that I find genuinely lovely once you turn it in the light. The very thing that makes a single breath feel like it does not matter is exactly the thing that makes the habit matter so much. Because it is automatic. Because you do not choose it breath by breath, the tongue's resting position becomes a kind of standing instruction, a default that gets obeyed all day and all night without review. If you had to consciously choose the route of every breath, you would choose well when you were paying attention and badly when you were not, and it would all average out to a muddle. But you do not choose. You set the default once, in a manner of speaking, by where the tongue habitually lives, and then that default runs on its own through the darkest, deepest, least conscious hours, through stage 2 sleep when, as those 12-wired sleepers showed us, the difference between the two rotes swells from almost nothing to more than double. The habit does its heaviest work precisely when you are least present to supervise it. The architect keeps building through the night whether or not the owner is awake to watch. Let me put a slightly different frame around the same truth, because I think it helps. Imagine you are not looking at breaths at all, but at votes. Every breath is one vote, cast for a slightly wider airway or a slightly narrower one, for a jaw that grows forward or a jaw that grows back, for a night that ends rested or a night that ends worn. And no single vote decides anything. An election is never decided by one vote in the sense that any one voter could point and say, "It was me." And yet the election is decided by nothing except the votes, all of them piled together. Your face, the particular set of your jaw, the exact width of the passage behind your tongue, these are the running tally of an election that has been going on quietly since before you could speak. An election in which the tongue's resting posture has been stuffing the ballot box, gently, one small breath at a time, for as long as you have been alive. I want to be careful here, the way I have tried to be careful all along, because it would be easy to let this rhythm and repetition idea run away with itself and turn into something grander than the evidence allows. So let me hold the reins for a moment. The counting is real. The arithmetic of 20,000 breaths a day is just arithmetic, and you can check it yourself with nothing but patience and a clock. The fact that repeated tiny influences can accumulate into large structural outcomes, that too is on solid ground, and we saw it directly in those X-ray trays. The shorter upper jaw, the more retruded set of it, the narrower passage behind, all of it lining up with breathing rote across childhood and adolescence with a confidence the statisticians were happy to stand behind. That much is firm. What I do not want to hand you is the idea that the count alone is destiny, that every breath is a hammer blow and your fate is sealed by a tally. Bodies are not stones, whatever I said about the drop. Bodies push back. They adapt, they repair, they respond to 100 other influences beside this one. The genes you were handed, the way you happen to grow, the shape you started with, all of these have their own votes in the same election, and some of them vote loudly. So the honest picture is not a hammer and a rock. It is a long, slow, crowded negotiation, in which the tongue's habit is one persistent voice among several, distinguished not by how loud it is on any given day, but by how faithfully it shows up, every hour, every night, never missing a session, for 800 million rounds. And there is a hopeful edge tucked inside that same picture, which I would be remiss to hide from you, though I will keep it modest. If the influence lives in the repetition rather than in any single mighty event, then the direction of the repetition is, at least in part, a thing that can shift. The drop that wore the ball was falling in one place. Move the drip, and over enough time the water finds a different course. I am not going to stand here and promise you that pressing your tongue to the roof of your mouth will remake anything overnight, because it will not, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling the single leaping event and ignoring the slow quiet count, which is exactly the mistake we have spent this whole long climb learning to see through. A grown skull is not a growing skull, and the years when the sculpture was most easily shaped are years that for many of us are already behind. But the routing of the breath, the resistance of the passage, the retention of that faint tide of carbon dioxide, the daily dose of the sinus gas, these are not fixed in stone. They answer to the default. And the default is a habit. And a habit, unlike a bone that has finished growing, is a thing that lives in the present tense, renewed or revised with every hour you are awake enough to notice it. So we have added time to the picture now, real time, the deep, slow time of the count, and it changes the texture of everything we built before. The gate, the punishing pipe, the measured night, the manufactured gas, the humming detour, the trade of carbon dioxide for oxygen at the tissue, the muscle that answers the pull of the throat, the workshop of the nose, the 20 days of one plugged and unplugged man, the 2 trays of skulls. Every one of those was, in a sense, a snapshot, a single frame. And what I have been trying to do in these last few minutes is start the film running so you can feel that none of those frames stands alone. That each is one instant lifted out of a river of instants, 800 million of them, flowing in one direction or another according to where a soft muscle happens to rest. There is one more thing about that river I have not yet said though, something about how the rhythm of it, the pace, the slowness or the hurry of the breathing itself, feeds back into the very chemistry we spoke of earlier. Because it turns out the count is not the only thing that matters about a repeated breath. The spacing between them matters too, and it matters in a way that loops right back to that curve we bent, the one where carbon dioxide quietly pries the oxygen loose. Think for a moment about what a breath actually is, not as a single event, but as a beat in a rhythm. When you breathe fast through an open mouth, gulping the air, you are not just choosing a wider pipe, you are choosing a faster tempo. And tempo, it turns out, has consequences all its own, quite apart from which door the air came through. Suppose you sit here breathing gently, in and out, maybe 6 times in a minute, maybe 8. Each breath carries some carbon dioxide out of you, because your blood delivers it to the little air sacs in the lungs and you blow it away. That is the whole point of exhaling, in a sense. But here is the quiet thing. If you speed up, if you pant, if you heave the air in and out 20 or 30 times a minute, the way a frightened animal does, you blow away carbon dioxide faster than your body is making it. And the level in your blood begins to fall. Now you might think, splendid, get rid of the waste, the more the better. But carbon dioxide is not simply waste. We saw that already when we bent that curve. Remember what carbon dioxide does. It is the thing that lowers the acidity just a whisker, and by lowering it, it loosens the grip that the hemoglobin has on its oxygen. The oxygen rides into the tissue firmly held, and then the local carbon dioxide made right there by the busy working cells taps the hemoglobin on the shoulder and says, "Let go here, this is the place that needs it." So the carbon dioxide is not the enemy of your oxygen. It is the usher that shows the oxygen to its seat. And if you purge too much of it, by breathing too fast, you have fewer ushers. The oxygen stays clamped to the hemoglobin, riding around the body still bound, unable to step off where it is wanted. You can have blood that is beautifully full of oxygen and tissues that are still, in a sense, hungry, because the oxygen will not come off the train. This is one of those things that sounds like a paradox the first time you meet it, and it stopped a good many clever people in their tracks when they first bumped into it. Breathe more, get less. Breathe harder, deliver less to the muscle that is crying out for it. It feels wrong, the way so many true things feel wrong. But you can see now that it is not magic. It is just the curve, the same curve, doing exactly what it always does, only you have starved it of the little acid nudge it needs. And the pace of your breathing is what starved it. So the spacing between the breaths, the unhurried gap, the willingness to let a little carbon dioxide accumulate before you sweep it away, that gap is not laziness. It is the very thing that keeps the ushers on duty. Here is where the tongue quietly comes back into the story, because I do not want you to think we have wandered off. When the mouth is sealed and the air must go through the nose, the passage is narrower and the resistance is higher, and you already know from the pipe and its fourth power how sharply that resistance can bite. What does a higher resistance do to your tempo? It slows you down. It will not let you gulp. Try it gently right now. Breathe through your nose only and try to pant fast the way you could through an open mouth. You cannot. Not really. The nose refuses. It meters the air out, patiently, like a narrow doorway that lets the crowd through one at a time instead of letting them stampede. And that enforced patience, that gentle throttling, keeps your carbon dioxide from being flung away too fast. So the sealed mouth is doing two jobs at once, and I find this the loveliest part. It is routing the air past the little nitric oxide workshop, yes. But it is also simply by being harder to breathe through, holding your rhythm down to a pace where the chemistry can do its proper work. The narrowness that looks like an obstacle is in fact a regulator. I want you to picture a river again, because we keep coming back to the river and it keeps repaying us. Imagine a wide, lazy river, and imagine a narrow gorge somewhere along it, where the water is forced through a tight rocky channel. Upstream of that gorge, the water backs up a little, sits, pulls, takes its time. The gorge does not stop the river. The same amount of water comes out the other side over a day. But moment to moment, the gorge steadies the flow. It smooths the rushes and the lulls into something even. The nose is that gorge for your breath. The open mouth is the river with the gorge blasted away, all rush and surge and no restraint, the water tearing through and carrying off whatever it likes, including the carbon dioxide you would have been wiser to keep a moment longer. And notice, this steadying feeds back on itself in a rather beautiful loop. Calmer breathing keeps more carbon dioxide about. More carbon dioxide within the gentle ordinary range keeps the oxygen unloading nicely into the tissues, including into the muscles of the throat, including into the very muscle we have been talking about, the tongue and its neighbors that hold the airway open. A well-fed muscle holds its tone. A muscle starved by clamped oxygen goes slack sooner. So there is a circle here. Nasal breathing steadies the pace. The steadier pace feeds the tissues better. The better fed tissues, the tongue among them, keep the airway open, and the open airway makes the easy nasal breathing possible in the first place. Round and round it supports itself. Break into it with a fast open mouth and the circle can turn the other way just as readily, each part nudging the next toward the slack, the narrow, the hurried. Now I have been careful, and I want to stay careful, because it would be easy to take a thing like this and inflate it into a cure for every ailment under the sun. That is not what I am telling you. The size of these effects, moment to moment, in a healthy person sitting quietly, is modest. Your body has splendid machinery for keeping the acidity of your blood within very tight bounds, no matter how you breathe. Kidneys and buffers and all manner of clever chemistry working in the background to hold the line. You are not going to overturn all of that with a few fast breaths. What we are talking about is a nudge, a lean, a small persistent bias applied not once but 800 million times over a life, which is exactly why it is worth understanding. A tiny lean, repeated past all counting, is how mountains are worn into valleys. It is how a footpath appears across a meadow where no one planted one. Nobody decided the path. Feet decided it, one soft step at a time, none of them meaning anything on its own. There is a lovely echo here of the very first thing we noticed all those minutes ago when I asked you simply to feel where your tongue was resting. Because the tongue's position and the breath's pace are not two separate facts you happen to hold at once. They are bound together. Where the tongue sits, sets which door the air uses, which door sets the resistance sets the pace sets the chemistry, and the chemistry, coming full circle, feeds the muscle that sets where the tongue can rest. You cannot really pull one thread out of that weave and look at it alone, though we have been pretending to one layer at a time. Because that is the only honest way to learn a tangled thing. You lay the threads out separately on the table. But nature never had them separate. Nature had them woven from the start. Let me give you one more way to feel the pace and the chemistry as a single thing, because I think it will stay with you as you drift off. When a person is calm, truly calm, drowsy, on the very edge of sleep as perhaps you are now, the breathing slows without any instruction. Nobody tells you to slow it. The count drops, the gaps between breaths grow long and unhurried, and the carbon dioxide is allowed to drift up into that comfortable middle range where the oxygen comes off the hemoglobin easily and the tissues are content. Calm and slow breathing are not two things that happen to travel together. They are almost the same thing seen from two sides, one the feeling and one the gas. And the slow breath, if the mouth is gently closed and the tongue is up where it belongs sealing that lower door, runs entirely through the nose, through the gorge, past the little workshop making its whiff of gas that will go down and open the vessels in the lungs. Everything we have built, all 10 layers of it, quietly assembles itself in a sleeping person doing nothing at all, wanting nothing, trying for nothing. That is the part I keep turning over. All this machinery, the fourth power in the pipe, the curve that carbon dioxide bends, the reflex in the muscle, the sinuses breathing out their invisible signal, none of it requires you to know a word of it. It ran in people who lived and died with no notion that any of it was there, thousands of years before anyone wired a sleeping volunteer to an instrument or held 2 trays of skulls up to the light. The knowing is new. The thing itself is old, older than language, older than us. And yet there is something the knowing gives you that the doing alone never did. It lets you feel the weight of a thing as small as where your tongue rests, and understand that it is not small at all, that it is a hand on a very long lever, and that the lever has been pressing, gently, all day and all night, in one direction or the other, whether or not you ever once thought to notice. So let me sit with that lever a little longer, because a lever is only interesting when you ask which way it wants to fall on its own. Left to itself, without any attention from you, where does the tongue go? And the honest answer is that it depends on what it has practiced. A muscle is a creature of habit in the most literal way. It does not have opinions. It has a resting length it has grown used to, a place it drifts to when you stop thinking, the way a door left ajar swings slowly to whatever position the hinges and the floor and the draft have quietly agreed upon over years. If, for most of your hours, the tongue has learned to lie low and slack on the floor of the mouth, then that is the position it will melt into the moment your attention wanders off to something else. And your attention wanders off constantly. That is the trouble with using conscious effort to fix a thing that runs all day. You cannot stand guard over your own tongue for 16 waking hours, let alone the 8 you spend asleep and unable to guard anything at all. Here is a thing worth turning over slowly. The moment you most need that gentle seal, the moment the whole arrangement matters the most, is precisely the moment you have the least say in it. When you are awake, you can decide to breathe through your nose. You can press the tongue up on purpose. You are the driver. But when you drift off, the driver leaves. The muscles of the throat go soft. The jaw, if nothing holds it, sags open under its own small weight. And whatever the tongue has practiced during the day is what it will do in the dark, when no one is watching and no one can intervene. This is why the daytime posture is not really about the daytime at all. It is a rehearsal. Every hour the tongue spends resting against the roof of the mouth while you are awake is an hour of teaching it where home is, so that when you lose consciousness and hand the whole business over to reflex and habit, the reflex and the habit carry it there without you. And remember, we already met the muscle that answers the call in the dark. The genioglossus, the big fan of muscle that makes up the bulk of the tongue, the one that stiffens and pulls forward the instant the airway feels that little tug of suction on the in-breath. That reflex does not switch off when you sleep. But it does get lazier, slower, less eager, the deeper you go. It is like a night watchman who is real and awake, but not quite as quick on his feet at 4 in the morning as he was at noon. So the airway leans more heavily on its passive shape while you sleep, on the plane geometry of how wide the tube happens to be when nobody is actively holding it open. And the plane geometry, we said, is ruled by that merciless fourth power, a throat that has been trained, night after night, to sit a little wider, with the tongue a little higher and more forward, gives that sleepy watchman an easier job. A throat that collapses inward the moment vigilance dips asks him to do heroic work at the worst possible hour, and some nights he simply cannot keep up. That is the quiet arithmetic behind the difference between 1.5 interruptions in an hour and 43 of them. Now I want to take you back to those 2 trays of skulls, because I raced past something and it deserves a slower look. When they measured the upper jaw in the chronic mouth breathers and found it shorter, about 51.5 millimeters against 55, you might think, well, 4 millimeters, that is nothing. That is the width of a few grains of rice. But you must ask what 4 millimeters means when it is missing from a bone that is meant to be the floor of your nose and the frame of your airway. The upper jaw, the maxilla, is not just where the top teeth live. It is the foundation of the whole midface. It is the floor beneath the nasal cavity. When it grows forward and wide, it opens up the room above it, the very passages the air must travel. When it grows short and pinched, it narrows that room from below. And what decides whether it grows forward and wide or short and pinched? In no small part, what has been pressing against it day after day during all the years the bone is soft enough to be shaped. A tongue held up against that palate is a slow, patient, living form pressing outward from the inside, encouraging the arch to spread. A tongue that lies on the floor of the mouth presses on nothing, and the palate, left to the inward squeeze of the cheeks with no counterforce from within, grows high and narrow instead, like a tent with no center pole. That is the sense in which I call the tongue an architect, and I want to be careful and fair about it, because it is easy to get carried away. The skulls in that study do not prove that posture alone carved every one of those differences. Bones are shaped by many hands. Genetics deals the first cards. Allergies, enlarged tonsils, a stuffed-up childhood, all of these push a person toward breathing through the mouth in the first place, and they leave their own marks. So we should not stand here and declare that a low tongue single-handedly retrudes a jaw or narrows a windpipe. What the numbers do show, plainly and with the differences too large and too consistent to wave away, is that the route the air takes and the shape the skull takes are traveling together through those growing years. They are correlated in a way that begs for a mechanism, and the mechanism we have, the living mold pressing from within, the airflow that keeps a passage patent, fits the shape of the evidence like a hand into a glove. It is not the whole story, but it is a real chapter of it, and it is written in bone. There is a gentleness to how slowly all of this happens that I find genuinely moving. Nothing about this is sudden. No single breath reshapes anything. No one night decides your jaw. It is the accumulation, the same small pressure repeated 10,000 times 10,000 times. The way a footpath appears across a meadow, not because any one person trampled the grass, but because 1,000 people each stepped lightly in roughly the same place. You cannot point to the step that made the path. There is no such step. There is only the sum. And the tongue's resting posture is exactly this kind of thing. A pressure so faint that on any given afternoon it seems absurd to imagine it mattering, and yet integrated over the years of a childhood, it is one of the quiet forces deciding the architecture of a face. Let me connect that back to the invisible gas, because there is a lovely symmetry hiding here. We have 2 very different time scales running at once, and the tongue sits at the meeting point of both. On the slow scale, over years, its posture is helping to shape the bony room the air moves through. And on the fast scale, breath by breath, second by second, that same posture is deciding whether the air even goes through the nose to pick up the nitric oxide the sinuses are quietly making. The slow work builds the house. The fast work decides whether you use the front door. And the beautiful, slightly maddening thing is that the 2 feed each other. Breathe through the nose as a child, and the house tends to get built with wider halls, which makes nasal breathing easier still, which reinforces the habit. Breathe through the mouth, and the halls tend to come out narrower, which makes the nose harder to use, which pushes you further toward the mouth. Each route, once taken, tends to pave itself. That is what people mean, without quite knowing the machinery, when they say a habit gets dug in. It is not only a rut in the mind, sometimes it is a rut in the bone. I do not want you to hear all this as a scolding, as if your tongue has been failing some test all these years. That is not the spirit of it at all. The spirit is closer to wonder that so much hinges on so little, and that the little thing is entirely yours, sitting there in the warm dark of your own mouth, doing what it has learned to do, asking nothing of you. There is no gadget in this story. Nothing to buy, nothing to plug in, nothing invented last year. There is only a piece of you that has always been there, and a set of consequences that reach further than you would ever have guessed. Into your sleep, into the oxygen reaching your muscles, into the shape of the very frame that holds your eyes and your smile. To know that is not to carry a burden. It is to be handed a small, strange fact about yourself that was true the whole time, waiting quietly to be noticed. And notice, if you have not already, that somewhere in the last little while your tongue has probably drifted again. It does that. You lifted it earlier, when we began, when I asked you to press it gently to the ridge behind your upper teeth, and then the ideas got interesting and your attention followed them, and the tongue, unwatched, went wherever it goes. That is not a failure either. That is just the truth of a muscle that runs itself. But it is worth feeling, right now in this drowsy moment, the difference between the two positions one more time, unhurried, with no goal in mind. Let it settle up against the palate if it will. Feel the mouth close itself. Feel the breath route, on its own, up through the nose, cool coming in, warm going out, past those little factories of gas you cannot see, through the passages of fourth power rules. And let it be, for now, simply a thing you have finally noticed, running as it has run all along. Let me sit with that muscle a moment longer, because there is a thing about it I have not quite said plainly, and it is one of my favorite kinds of thing. The genioglossus, the big fan of muscle that fills the floor of the mouth and shoves the tongue forward, is not waiting for you to send it an order. It has its own little loop of behavior wired below the level of your deciding. When the throat feels a pull of suction inside it, a pressure drop as you draw a breath, that muscle answers by tightening and reaching forward, as if to say, no you don't, this pipe stays open. In careful measurements on awake, healthy people, a gentle pulse of negative pressure in the nose, only 2.5 to 7.5 centimeters of water, mind you, which is a very soft tug, was enough to make the electrical chatter of that muscle jump right away. Not after thinking. Right away. It is a reflex, the way your knee kicks when the doctor taps it. Now think about what that means for the two tongues we have been comparing all night. The tongue up against the palate, sealed and suctioned, is already forward, already gathered, already holding its shape. When the suction of a breath arrives, it has almost no distance to travel to do its job. It is a guard standing at his post. But the tongue slumped low and back, lolling toward the throat, is a guard asleep in a chair. When the same suction comes, that reflex still fires, the muscle still reaches, but now it is reaching from behind, from a slack and crowded position, trying to haul a heavy soft thing forward out of the doorway it has half fallen into. Same reflex. Same little jolt of electricity. Utterly different result. Because posture set the stage before the reflex ever spoke its line. And this, you see, is why I keep coming back to the word posture, which sounds like something a school teacher nags you about, and is really about where a muscle starts its work from. There is a gentleness to this that I do not want you to miss as you drift. Nobody is asking that tongue to strain. The whole marvel of the sealed posture is that it costs almost nothing to hold once it becomes the resting place. A suction tongue is held partly by a little vacuum, the same trick a wet leaf uses to stick to a window, the same trick that keeps a suction cup on the tile. You are not clenching. You are letting a small held emptiness do the holding for you, and from that easy, lazy, leaning position, the whole downstream cascade we have walked through simply follows, without anybody at the controls. The mouth stays shut, the air goes up the nose warms it and wets it and strains the dust from it. The sinuses breathe their faint blue whisper of gas into the stream. The slightly harder pull keeps a touch more of that carbon dioxide in the blood, and the blood holding it lets go of its oxygen more freely right where a working muscle is asking for it. All of that, from a leaf stuck to a window, from a guard already standing at his post. I want to turn the thing over once more and look at it from underneath, because there is a question a sharp person would ask me right about now, half asleep or not. If nasal breathing is harder, if the passage is narrower and the resistance higher, then why on earth would harder be better? We spend our whole lives being told that easier is better, that the smooth road beats the rough one. And here I am telling you that the rougher road through the nose does something good that the easy road through the mouth does not. That deserves an answer, And the answer is one of the quietly beautiful ideas in all of physiology, so let me lay it out slowly, the way you would lay out cards. Your body is not actually short of oxygen most of the time. This surprises people. The blood leaving your lungs, even now, even lying there breathing softly, is already almost completely loaded with oxygen. You cannot load it much fuller by gulping air. The bottleneck, the real question, is never quite getting oxygen onto the blood. The real question is getting it off the blood again, out of the red cells and into the hungry tissue that needs it at the exact spot where it is needed. And here is the trick nature plays. The very thing your fast, panic mouth breathing tries to blow away, the carbon dioxide, is the messenger that tells the blood where to let its oxygen go. Carbon dioxide is not just waste smoke from the fire. It is the signal. Where the tissue is busiest, it makes the most carbon dioxide, and that little rise in carbon dioxide, that little dip towards sourness in the blood right there, loosens hemoglobin's grip and spills the oxygen out precisely where the demand is highest. Blow off too much carbon dioxide by over-breathing through a wide open mouth, and you have thrown away the messenger. The blood clings to its oxygen more tightly, and, of all the strange results, you can end up with plenty of oxygen in the blood and still less of it reaching the muscle. Harder breathing, which keeps the messenger, hands the oxygen over more generously. That is the whole upside-down secret of it. I find I have to stop and admire that, because it runs against every instinct we have. We think of breathing hard and fast as the way to get more air, more oxygen, more life. And in a real emergency, of course, you must breathe, you must move air. But in the long, quiet, ordinary hours, the hours you spend asleep, the hours you spend reading, the hours you spend being alive without any drama at all, the slow, resisted breath through the narrow nose is quietly doing a better job of the one thing that actually matters, which is delivery. Not acquisition. Delivery. The nose is not a better warehouse. It is a better mail carrier. And notice how many separate little systems have to agree for that to work. Systems that grew up over an enormous stretch of time without ever holding a meeting. The shape of the nose, folded and turbinate and full of warm, wet passages. The chemistry of the sinuses cooking their faint gas. The physics of the pipe, obeying that ferocious fourth power so that a small narrowing means a large resistance. The chemistry of the blood, tuned so that the waste gas is also the signal. The reflex in the tongue, ready to stiffen the door. And on top of all of it, sitting like a keystone, the simple resting place of a single muscle against the roof of the mouth, which either sets all of this in motion or lets it fall slack. It is a little bit like walking into a great old workshop and finding that every lathe and belt and pulley traces back, if you follow the shafts, to one slow wheel turning in the corner. The tongue is not the most dramatic part. It is just the wheel the belts are hung on. There is one more thing I want to hand you before we come round to the end of all this, and it is the thing that first made me sit up straight when I understood it, because it moves the whole story off the scale of a single breath and onto the scale of a whole growing life. A breath lasts a few seconds. A reflex fires in a fraction of one. But the same small differences we have been chasing, breath by breath, do not stop when the breath is over. They accumulate. They add up, slowly, silently, in the one material you would least expect to be soft enough to change, which is bone. The jaw is not carved once and finished. It is grown, and it grows into the space it is given, and it is pushed and coaxed all through childhood by the soft things pressing on it from the inside, the tongue most of all. A tongue up against the palate all day, year after year, presses outward and broadens the arch and holds the upper jaw forward. A tongue slumped on the floor of the mouth presses nowhere useful, and the arch grows narrow, and the roof of the mouth climbs higher and pinches the passages above it, and the face lengthens, and the airway that all of this was supposed to protect gets quietly smaller, the very opposite of what you would wish. The soft daily habit becomes the hard permanent shape. That is not a metaphor. That is measurable on an X-ray film, and it is where, gently unhurried, we are going to end up when I show you two trays of skulls side by side. But not yet. Let that sit on the horizon a moment more, the way I promised you it would at the very beginning, a distant shape you are only now beginning to make out. For now, just the breath. Just the resting place. Feel it once more, without effort, without correction, without any sense that you are doing an exercise, because you are not. You are only noticing. The tongue, wherever it has drifted, and the slow, cool air, and the whole hidden machinery running underneath the noticing, patient, ancient, indifferent to whether you understand it. It ran before you knew any of this. It will keep running after the word stop. And the only thing that has changed, the single small thing, is that a part of you now knows what that wheel in the corner has been turning all along.